This cassette package represents a milestone in the history of the development of the ideas of two outstanding psychologists, B.F. Skinner and Carl R. Rogers. As indicated in the accompanying pamphlet, the dialogue included here remains as their most thorough exploration of their respective points of view. I think you will find their ideas as challenging today as they were in 1962. Listening to these tapes should also give you some feeling for the excitement we experienced in participating in that dialogue. The first cassette begins with their opening statements.
At this time, then, we shall turn to the first presentation. You recall, according to your program, that we are allowing approximately 15 minutes, first for Dr. Rogers and then for Dr. Skinner, to give a brief review of the controversy as they see it. It gives me then great satisfaction to present to you Dr. Carl R. Rogers.
Thank you, Dr. Gladstein. It's good to be here, good to see Fred Skinner again, good to look forward to the chance of having an opportunity to pursue in depth some of our common interests and common differences. I also look out over this audience, which I expected to be a very small audience, and I'm tempted to say, who are you? But I trust that we will learn as we begin to get questions and contributions from you. I'd like to try to summarize very briefly some of the important elements which underlie our dialogue as they seem to me. I think there's a fresh current in our culture, a fresh breeze that's blowing through the world, that's exhibiting itself in many ways and speaking through many voices. It's expressed in the growing interest in existentialism and in the existentialist point of view. It's evident in ways that may seem odd to some of you, such as the interest in Zen Buddhism. It shows itself in the concern with the self in psychology and in the interest in a phenomenological approach to psychological problems. Even on the political scene, it is evident, I believe, in the upsurge of one new country after another arising out of a colonial past. It is exhibited in what Maslow has termed the new third force in American psychology, the development of self-theories, the concern with the existential person, the discussions of being and becoming, as over against the two older forces, the positivistic behaviorism point of view and the Freudian point of view. As I endeavor to understand this vigorous new cultural trend, it seems to me to be the voice of subjective man speaking up loudly for himself. Man has long felt himself to be but a puppet in life, molded by world forces, by economic forces. He has been enslaved by persons, by institutions, and more recently by aspects of modern science. But he is firmly setting forth a new declaration of independence. He is discarding the alibis of unfreedom. He is choosing himself, endeavoring to become himself, not a puppet, not a slave, not a copy of some model, but his own unique individual self. He is saying in no uncertain terms, I am, I exist, I choose myself in life, I choose the meaning of death. I find myself very sympathetic to this trend because it is so deeply in line with the experience I have had in working with clients in therapy. As one therapist has said, The essence of therapy is the client's movement from feeling unfree and controlled by others toward the frightening but rewarding sense of freedom to map out and choose his new personality. I myself, in one of the papers that some of you have read, have described the therapeutic development as a self-initiated process of learning to be free. This learning is composed of movement from as well as movement toward. From being persons driven by inner forces they do not understand, fearful and distrustful of these deeper feelings and of themselves, and living by values they have taken from others, they move significantly. They move toward being persons who accept and even enjoy their own feelings, who value and trust the deeper layers of their nature, who find strength in being their own uniqueness, who live by values that they experience. This learning, this movement, enables them to live as more individuated, more creative, more responsive, and more responsible persons. Clients are, as I have tried to indicate, often sharply aware of such directions in themselves as they move with fearfulness toward being freely themselves. But how can I talk about freedom when, as a behavioral scientist, I conduct research on the assumption that the sequences of cause and effect operate quite as much in the psychological as in the physical world? What possible definition of freedom can there be in a modern world? Let me try to tell you what it means to me, again quoting from one of these papers. In the first place, the freedom which my clients experience is essentially an inner thing, something which exists in the living person, quite aside from any outward choice of alternatives which we so often think of as constituting freedom. I'm speaking of the kind of freedom which Frankl vividly described in his experience of the concentration camp, when everything, possessions, identity, choice of alternatives, was taken from the prisoners. But even months and years in such an environment showed only, and I quote, that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. It is this inner, subjective, existential freedom which I have observed. It is the realization in my clients that I can live myself here and now by my own choice. It is the quality of courage which enables a person to step into the uncertainty of the unknown as he chooses himself. It is the discovery of meaning from within oneself, meaning which comes from listening sensitively and openly to the complexities of what one is experiencing. It is the burden of being responsible for the self one chooses to be. It is the recognition by the person that he is an emerging process, not a static end product. The individual who is thus deeply and courageously thinking his own thoughts, becoming his own uniqueness, responsibly choosing himself, may be fortunate in having hundreds of objective outer alternatives from which to choose, or he may be unfortunate in having none, but his freedom exists regardless. So we are first of all speaking of something which exists within the individual, of something phenomenological rather than objective, but nonetheless to be prized. A second point in defining this experience of freedom is that it exists not as a contradiction to the picture of the psychological universe as a sequence of cause and effect, but as a complement to such a universe. Freedom, rightly understood, is a fulfillment by the person of the ordered sequence of his life. As Martin Buber puts it, the free man believes in destiny and believes that it stands in need of him. He moves out voluntarily, freely, responsibly, to play his significant part in a world whose determined events move through him and through his spontaneous choice and will. This is the experience of one client after another as he moves in therapy toward an acceptance of the realities of the world outside and inside himself, and also moves toward becoming a responsible agent in this real world. As I've indicated before, this significant human freedom exists alongside the complete determinism of modern science as a paradox. It exists in our human experience with as much reality as do the facts of science, and we cannot wisely disregard it. It's one of the great contributions of our century that we are beginning to realize that man's moods, attitudes, actions, his adaptations as well as his maladaptations can be understood in the same lawful terms as the events of the physical world. Viewed from this objective perspective, it seems probable that we will increasingly be able to understand man's actions in terms of laws which will be similar to the scientific laws discovered in the natural sciences. It is this that leads to the possibility of being able to control human behavior. It's this that leads to the issue of this discussion. There seems no doubt but that the behavioral sciences will move steadily in the direction of making man an object to himself, a complex sequence of events, no different in kind from the complex chain of equations by which various chemical substances interact to form new substances or to release energy. But no matter how completely man comes to understand himself as a determined phenomenon, the product of past elements and forces, and the determined cause of future events and behaviors, he can never live as an object. He can only live subjectively. Some of the most pathetic individuals I know are those who are continually attempting to understand and predict their behavior objectively. Each action is meaningful to them only as the predetermined effect of preceding causes, and their whole life becomes an unhappy caricature of the centipede self-consciously watching his feet. In my experience, some of the failures in psychoanalytic therapy sometimes exhibit this over-intellectualized objectivity toward themselves. But the person who is developing his full potential is able to accept the subjective aspect of himself and to live subjectively. When he's angry, not merely an exhibition of the effects of adrenaline. When he loves, he's loving, and not merely cathected toward a love object. He moves in self-selected directions. He chooses responsibly. He's a person who thinks and feels and experiences. He is not merely an object in whom these events occur. We cannot, without great peril, deny this subjective element in ourselves. It precedes our scientific activities. It's more all-encompassing than scientific knowledge. It is an essential part of being human, of being a person, and no present or future development of the behavioral sciences can ever contradict this basic fact. Yet I'm very well aware that the experimentalist, positivist, behaviorist stream of thought in psychology, and Dr. Skinner is a most able exponent of that trend, hold very different views. For example, here are some of the words and concepts that I have used, which are totally or almost totally without meaning in the behaviorist frame of reference. Freedom, for example, is a term with no meaning. Choice, in the sense that I have used it, has no meaning. Subjectivity is, I believe, regarded as of very little importance. Purpose, self-direction, value or value choice, none of these have any meaning. Personal responsibility as a concept has no meaning. The democratic philosophy of human nature, Dr. Skinner has pointed out, has been a useful resource of the revolutionist in the past, but is now very probably out of date. So it's clear that some of the most basic concepts of this new third force in psychology have no meaning at all for the behaviorist group. I trust that this dialogue, today and tomorrow, may help us to clear up any misunderstandings of such differences, and also to clarify our differences where real differences do exist. In summary, I would say that to the extent that a behaviorist point of view in psychology is leading us toward a disregard of the person, or toward treating persons primarily as manipulable objects, or toward control of the person, shaping up his behavior without his participant choice, or toward minimizing the significance of the subjective, then I question it very deeply. My experience would lead me to say that to that extent, it's going against one of the strongest undercurrents of modern life and is taking us down a pathway with destructive consequences.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward the cassette to the end, and then turn to side 2 for the continuation of this program.
At this point, we will ask Dr. B.F. Skinner, Harvard University, to present his own brief review of the controversy as he sees it. Dr. Skinner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gladstein. Carl Rogers. I always make the same mistake. When debating with Carl Rogers, I always assume that he will make no effort to influence the audience. And then I have to follow him and speak, as I am speaking now, to a group of people who are very far from free to accept my views. In fact, I was just reminded of a story that I once heard about Carl Rogers, and I'll tell it now, hoping to confirm or have him deny it. I suppose it is apocryphal, at least I'm sure it has grown in this dimension. The story, if I heard it, is as follows. Carl Rogers was never much of a duck hunter, but he was persuaded upon one occasion to go duck hunting. He and some friends went into a blind and sat through a dreary, cold, early dawn, and no ducks arrived until the very end of the time when shooting was possible. Finally, one lone duck came in, and his friends allowed him to shoot, and he did. At the same time, along the shore, a few hundred yards away, another man shot at the same duck. The duck fell plop. Dr. Rogers got out of the blind and started toward the duck. The other man got out of the blind, and his blind started toward the same duck. They arrived at the same moment. Dr. Rogers turned to him and said, "You feel that this is your duck." The reason I was reminded of that story was that the end of it is that Dr. Rogers brought the duck home. I shall do my best to prevent a similar... We do agree on a good many things, and I like to feel that perhaps I have had some influence on Dr. Rogers, because from time to time he has conceded certain things. He has agreed that human behavior has been controlled and is probably coming to be controlled with greater and greater success as the science of behavior evolves. Now, the controllability of behavior is an old story, of course. Historians have always been delighted when they could prove an influence of some kind of biographical event on a hero. Biographers take the same line. The social sciences have certainly brought further evidence of its statistical nature, and I believe that an experimental analysis of the behavior of an individual organism has now essentially clinched the point. I don't believe you could ever prove that all of the behavior of human organism is controlled. But the assumption is, I think, more plausible, at least as a working assumption for science, and I believe also as a working assumption for more general considerations regarding human affairs in general. Now, Dr. Rogers, in conceding this much, has tended to narrow the notion of control. In the paper that I refer to, he cites as examples of recent advances in controlling behavior the evidence that under certain social conditions, a man may be led to make judgments which are contrary to the evidence of his senses. In other experiments, it has been shown that a person may change his opinion without being aware of what has influenced him to do so. He has cited satisfying electrical stimulation as an all-compelling kind of gratification that might very well be used to control behavior. And of course, the effects of drugs in producing vivid hallucinations, changes in disposition, personality, would also be cited by Dr. Rogers. Now, control, to me, means much more than this. These particular examples are examples of surreptitious control, control where the controllee is not aware that he is being controlled, or they are special examples of powerful control. Now, what I'm talking about when I say the control of human behavior is any contribution which is made toward determining a man's action. It does not need to be surreptitious. It does not mean that the man may not be fully aware of what's being done to him, and it does not mean that it would be 100% successful. I'm talking about such control as is achieved in economics with various wage systems, the ordinary rather ineffective ones, or special incentive wages, and so on. And one has only to examine other nations, other cultures, to appreciate the extent to which in America our economic system does energize people, makes them productive, makes them enterprising in undertaking new kinds of things. I mean by control the various police and military forces which governments use to keep people working within certain legal frameworks. I mean by control the various techniques which are used in education to bring about what we call the acquisition of knowledge or traits of character and so on. Now, the fact that occasionally an employee doesn't go to work for the day, or occasionally a man becomes a hobo and stops working altogether, or the fact that a student plays hooky, or that someone breaks a law or escapes from jail, this does not mean to me that these are not very powerful controlling influences. The exceptions are to be expected, because in no one of these cases are the variables which are manipulated the only variables, and hence the control is not 100%. So I hope that when we're talking here about control, we will speak more generally and not limit this to concealed control, although there are special problems involved there, I admit, and would not also hope to deal only with 100% effective control. Now, that is one thing that I wanted to state in these early remarks. I think it will come up again in the discussions. Another one has to do with the implications of the notion that human behavior is controlled. And let's, for the moment, just talk about complete control. Another one of my valued opponents in this line of thinking is Joseph Wood Crouch, whose book, The Measure of Man, published, I think, in 1954, is largely an attack on Walden 2, my utopian novel, and also on other works of mine. He's recently returned to the attack in an article in the Saturday Review of Literature, in which suddenly I find myself classed with the existentialists, but being cited by Crouch as symbolizing what he calls the dead end of the tendency represented by Darwin and Marx. And he cites me as denying categorically and absolutely that man has any control over his destiny, that he has any power to choose or determine. And he goes on to document this by saying that I write in my book, Science and Human Behavior, the inner man who is held responsible for the behavior of the external biological organism is only a pre-scientific substitute for the kinds of causes which are discovered in the course of a scientific analysis. And all these causes lie outside the individual. And he goes on, from this dead end. Now, the fact that man is, let us assume for the moment, completely controlled by his genetic and environmental history does not in any sense mean that he cannot control his own destiny. He has already been doing this both in the field of genetics and in the field of the environment. Because from the very beginning of civilization or culture or man as we know him, man has been working upon the very genetic and environmental forces which are responsible for him. And the geneticists today are beginning to talk quite openly about the possibility of improvements in man through genetic measures. Just yesterday, evidently according to the morning paper, Professor Huxley has come out again in favor of sperm banks or special donor fathership, so that in the world of the future the father will be proud not that the child is of his own blood, but that he has the best blood that money can buy. And the environmental control is already here and has been here for thousands of years. Man is largely responsible for the environment in which men live. He certainly is responsible for this very pleasant environment here this afternoon in every detail. We live more and more in a man-made world, and it has been a world which man has worked out largely because of its bearing upon his behavior. It has reduced the need to escape from extremes of temperature and so on. We tend to be reasonably comfortable, well-fed, and can then devote ourselves to things which are more important. This is a contribution of a purely physical technology. But the social technology, the cultural technology, which has gone along with this, is even more important. What man has done is to create for himself a world in which he is governed, in which he is employed, or in which he can hire, in which he can gain necessary wealth through borrowing or stealing or something of that kind. He has built a world in which he is able to behave in ways which would otherwise be impossible. And in this sense, he has controlled himself. If it is true that human behavior is 100% the product of a genetic and environmental history, it is nevertheless true that man has created and can modify that genetic and environmental history, and in that sense, he can control himself. Now, that is not a pun. I'm not playing on words here. Very often, it is true, the man who builds the environment, whether it's a physical world or a cultural world, is not the man who is controlled by it. But that is often the case. And as I've analyzed elsewhere, the techniques of self-control, which we can extract from religious, ethical, moral works of the past, can be analyzed in terms of a manipulation of an environment with the result that the man who is thus manipulated the environment will behave in a way which will cause him less trouble or gain him greater achievements. So that we do control ourselves, even in a world in which human behavior is totally controlled, because we modify that behavior. Now, this may seem, again, even if you don't regard it as a play on words, it may seem logically impossible. But the point is that we do this not because even then we step outside any causal stream or outside the stream of history, but because it happens to be in man's nature to take steps of this sort. And this brings me to a third theme which we will certainly be dealing with again and again, I'm sure, in this debate. That is the so-called choice of values. Why do we, in controlling man, control him in one direction and not in another? How do we decide in advance how we want to control? This comes up in the case of education. Suppose you have a very powerful educational technique. What will you teach? If psychology can tell you the techniques, can it tell you what ought to be taught? So now, This is the whole field of value judgment, but I don't think that it need necessarily be put outside the realm of science. As far as I'm concerned, there is only one science, there's only one way of knowing, and that it may be in the hands of scientists or in others, but it comes to the same thing. And I don't know of any special wisdom which is available when science must stop and turn the choice of values over to others. As I see the question of values, they concern some characteristics of human behavior which have led to various kinds of explorations in the design of culture. You can explain some activities of man in the case of physical technology by appealing to the immediate results. Early peoples hunt and fish for food because in hunting and fishing you are reinforced immediately with something edible. Later, culture develops methods of storing food, drying, preserving, freezing. They develop methods of agriculture where something must be done in the early spring and you eat only in late August or September perhaps, and so on. Slowly, a culture builds a capacity to do things because of more and more remote consequences. Now, this is also true in the case of the cultural technology which man has worked out. A strong man, able to whip anyone else in a battle, will steal, will take from others, will force them to labor for him, and so on. This becomes an early, primitive kind of governmental structure. And we explain it in terms of the immediate reinforcement of the strong man who is capable of exerting that kind of power. Later, a government which becomes more sensible in its long-term consequences will work out ways of controlling which will not resort to brute force and will have a greater survival value in the long run because such governments will make better use of the people governed. As you can trace in physical technology, the becoming important of more and more remote consequences, so you can trace this in cultural technology, and I think this brings us to what is, my way of thinking, the crucial issue. Now, Dr. Rogers has referred to the suggestion that there are three ways of looking at human behavior: the Freudian or the positivistic behaviorist, or that way I happen to name for it, which emphasizes the selfhood of the individual, becomes an interest in the self as a source of wisdom, a source of strength in altering conduct. My colleague David McClelland has written a book on psychoanalysis and religion, which has taken the same theme, but has left out, I suppose, the positivistic view. McClelland, taking his cue from David Lacan's very interesting book on Freud's sources, has noted that the Protestant Reformation and the Jewish Hasidic mystical movement, and Freud from the latter in his psychoanalysis, all exemplified a kind of revolt against external control. This is the conflict between psychoanalysis and governmental operations, for example. It is the general turning to the individual to find salvation. This is the theme, of course, of the Protestant Reformation, that one can seek one's God within himself and so on. And Freud carries this out, hoping to find within the individual the source of a pattern of life which is not imposed from outside. Now, I don't think that is a correct way of stating the case, and I think it can be modified in a way which fits my purposes very well. The change is not from an external control of the individual to internal control. It is a change from coercive, punitive control to other techniques of control which are related in the long run, as you won't be surprised to hear me say, to positive reinforcement. There are ways in which you can control people so that you influence what they want to do. And there are ways in which you control them so that they are forced to do what they do not want to do. Now, a shift from a legalistic, coercive system to individual freedom, this is the whole theory of democracy too, appears to take the good behavior of the individual out of the hands of the police and turn it over to the individual himself. I suggest, as a subject for future discussion here, that it will turn out that the inner control, which is then discovered as an alternative to the external, is nothing but the product of another kind of external control, which has been concerned with getting individuals to want to behave in certain ways rather than in coercing them to behave in those ways because of an external threat. As I see the trend of the evolution of culture, it is away from the rather immediate, punitive, successful ways of controlling people to those more remote techniques which are based upon a knowledge of human behavior, require a very sensitive understanding of these techniques, which in the long run exert a much more powerful control, and a control which I believe it's more likely to build a stronger group because it releases resources, and here I would agree with Dr. Rogers, of the individual, which are quite lost under aversive control. So those are the three things I wanted to mention. We do agree that behavior is controlled, but I want to interpret that broadly. We, I hope, agree that even on an assumption of complete determinism, man is and has been free to determine his destiny by the design of the world which determines him, and that the slow evolution of cultural practices could very well be working toward the releasing of potentialities of the individual without necessarily thereby leaving it in the last analysis to the individual to determine his own behavior.
Dr. Skinner suggests that I start off since he emitted the last words. I think first I'd like to clear up this duck story. There's a great deal of truth in that story, except for the punchline. Instead of saying, if you feel that you shot the duck, we resorted instead to a procedure very highly regarded in scientific circles. We flipped a coin, and that proved that I had shot the duck. As I listened to Dr. Skinner's remarks, I felt, as I often have when I have read his material, that there is so much on which we are in real agreement that it's puzzling to know why would 500 people turn out to see what the differences are. And I think I take that seriously, that although we do seem to be in agreement on a great many scores, yet I suspect there are some real differences which are not entirely verbal. I don't believe you people would all be interested if you didn't feel there was something more at stake here other than slight semantic differences. I'm not sure yet that I can really pin down what those differences are. I think one feeling I had as he spoke is that the scientific view is the whole world for him, it seemed to me. It isn't that it is one very, very useful way in which we perceive the world. It is the whole world. I noticed he had no comment on the paradox that to me has considerable meaning. I hope he will comment on that. There's one story I want to tell that would also bear on that same issue, I believe. For more than a year now, I've wanted to ask Dr. Skinner about this. We were both at a conference in Boston, a little more than a year ago, I think.
Fall of 60, I think.
I thought it was May of 61. Well, I don't know. It was quite a while ago.
Well, it was published in summer of 61. That must have
No,
been
maybe
fall
so.
of 60.
Okay. He had given his paper on the design of cultures and then had commented on that. After hearing his comments, I directed these remarks to him. I'll read this from the tape-recorded discussion. I said, from what I understood Dr. Skinner to say, it is his understanding that though he might have thought he chose to come to this meeting, might have thought he had a purpose in giving this speech, such thoughts are really illusory. He actually made certain marks on paper and emitted certain sounds here simply because his genetic makeup and his past environment had operantly conditioned his behavior in such a way that it was rewarding to make these sounds, and that he as a person doesn't enter into this. In fact, if I get his thinking correctly from his strictly scientific point of view, he as a person perhaps doesn't exist. I thought I would draw him out on the subjective side of why he was there, but to my amazement, he said he wouldn't go into the question of whether he had any choice in the matter, and added, "I do accept your characterization of my own presence here." I've wondered ever since. I really would like you to comment further, because I think that gets close to the heart of some of the differences between us.
I think it gets very close. There is this strange feeling that if you deny the individual freedom or deny the interpretation of the individual based upon freedom and personal responsibility, that somehow or other the individual vanishes. Well, this is not at all the conclusion that one could arrive at, as I indicated very briefly in stating one of what I thought would be a recurring theme. I think you can make the assumption that each of us is completely determined to do what he is now doing and is going to do by his own genetic and environmental history. I say this to my class at the end of the term. I give a course in human behavior with a fairly large number of students, and many of them become very anxious about this. In fact, I just this year have learned two strange things about my course at Harvard. One, that it sends more students to courses in the divinity school than any other undergraduate course. And also that it sends more to the health service. There is a special syndrome which they recognize when it turns up. Now, I try to reassure my students, and I think in the long run, obviously if they go on to the health service or the divinity school afterward, I haven't been successful in this, but I think in general I am, in pointing out to them that each of them is an absolutely unique locus through which certain lines of force pass. Each one of you represents an absolutely unique genetic combination of factors in the evolution of the human race. Each of you represents an absolutely unique combination of environmental forces. Your family, and when you were a child, the school you passed through, the various books you read, the various governmental and economic forces under which you lived, and so on. Now, I can visualize the growth of a more and more successful human being as a biological organism and a more and more successful culture or society as a cultural organization or as an organism which has proceeded via the ordinary principles of evolution and the eventual selection of the more and more powerful version when diversity turns up, which gives me a reasonable sense of my own individuality, and I think very good reason for telling anyone else that he is himself an individual and has possibly very important contributions to make. Now, I don't do this to exhort my students. That would be quite inconsistent of me to exhort them, except insofar as I can prove that my own history has suggested that I might exhort in order to produce certain effects. I don't believe in exhorting. I don't believe in the notion of personal responsibility in a legal sense. I think it disappears when you resort to non-aversive techniques of control. This is an issue which in our earlier debate I brought up, that when people are held responsible for their acts in the sense that they can be justly punished for doing something, the consequences of which they foresaw, then you have a meaning to the notion of responsibility. So when they have been induced to behave in other ways without aversive consequences entering into the picture, there is no meaning to the conception of personal responsibility. But there is never any question of the uniqueness of the individual or of his possible importance in the evolution of a future culture. I don't think anything we have now is by any means the last word.
I'd kind of like to come back to the first part of that, because one of the things I have thought about is, what meaning, I wonder, would it have to a person, say, like a freedom rider, to tell him that he is the locus of a number of unique forces which have conditioned him to move southward, have conditioned him to sit in certain places which are illegal, he's been operantly conditioned and rewarded for behaviors which would bring him in conflict with the law. He finds it rewarding to emit certain sounds when he's beaten, etc. I mean, I recognize the picture of behavior that you are giving as a picture that seems to me to be in line with in general line with our current knowledge of people as viewed from the outside. But I notice you steer very clear always of even taking a look at the person from the inside. And when I think of trying to explain to a freedom rider his actions in those terms, I don't believe, I not only don't believe he would accept it, I believe that this makes something quite meaningless out of something which socially has meaning. Does this make any sense to you at all?
I think there are 2 points here. You might ask the question, supposing I could convince this freedom rider that I was right, would he then stop being a freedom rider? I think you're getting at that for one thing, aren't you? That it is his conception of himself as someone who can do something to bring about an important change, for which he will then be able to take a modest credit, and so on. Certain people at least will admire him for having done this, and so on. Now, I think he does do this because of a heritage which has come to him from his own culture regarding the necessity for undertaking a certain kind of martyrdom, undergoing punitive treatment in order to bring about some other state of affairs. If he has been through a culture which goes in for this, he will do it. There are many cultures which would never produce freedom riders at all. Now, apart from whether he would then stop, there is the other issue as to whether it is correct to say that he is doing this for reasons which are important to him beyond his training. The converse of this is what happens to the delinquent or the alcoholic when he has seized upon this justification. He will say, well, I'm sorry, I know I'm an old drunk, but I really am ill. You shouldn't complain, you shouldn't criticize me, I need treatment. Now, up to a certain point, society has controlled drunkenness by shaming the town drunk, by teaching children either to laugh at these people, it's still good comedy to put on a drunk act in a play, or to have them blame these people, to point out how their families suffer, and so on. This is an effort to control through punishment. Now, a modern view of this is that I think that is wrong, it just doesn't work. And the better view would be to try to find other ways of treating an alcoholic, and the alcoholic may seize upon this to escape from the censure and blame. Well, he's more or less entitled to do that in the sense that you have left yourself open to this. When you shift from one technique of control through punishment to another, which will, let us say in that case, it might very well be medical, but it could be through positive educational measures. When you shift, there is a transitional period in which people do seem to be at loose ends. They're lost. The old system isn't working. The new system hasn't taken control. In both cases, you have a form of control, but I think you have, in the long run, a better one if you could work out a positive educational treatment for alcoholism. This would involve a great deal of cultural engineering. It would be very difficult. I myself think that any government worth its salt should prohibit any advertising which makes the consumption of alcoholic beverages attractive or honorable or distinguished and so on. I'm not saying you ought to keep people from buying alcoholic beverages. That didn't work. But I think you ought to be able to keep advertisers from making the drinking of alcoholic beverages look beautiful and glamorous and so on. I mean, this is a fault in a kind of design of a culture. And if you could eliminate all of that with a positive educational program, I think you could treat the alcoholic so that he would no longer need to be shamed or thrown in jail or punished or threatened with damnation, whatever the aversive control is. And I would myself prefer a culture which works that way, not possibly because of my own preference for non-aversive techniques, but because in the long run, such a culture would be more effective. In such a culture, there would be no moral struggle. There would be no need for exerting one's personal responsibility.
Well, as I listen to that, the message I'm getting from it, and I'd be glad to be corrected if it's not right, is that you're saying, I'll talk at any length about how one influences or controls behavior from the outside, but any comments on whether man's subjective view of himself has any importance whatsoever, that I don't wish to get into. And I guess what I'm saying, and what I was trying to indicate when I talked about the Freedom Rider, is that if we take only the objective external perspective on man, if this is kind of a modern Calvinism is the way it strikes me, where the clock was all wound up originally and it now runs inevitably to its conclusion. And if we say that's the total picture of man, there's nothing more to be said about this Freedom Rider or any other person other than that he is quite inevitably doing exactly what he was conditioned to do, and that he himself as a person has no part in this. If that is given as our total picture of man, then to me that's insufficient, that's inadequate. It gives a picture of man as meaningless. I think it gives a picture of the universe as meaningless. And I guess the reason why I can't help but have some feeling about this is that it doesn't for a moment check with what I learn with people from the inside. In other words, in one sense, I find myself certainly in 90% or more agreement with all you say about people when you're talking about them from the outside, but I notice you are never willing to get at them from the inside.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward the cassette to the end, and then turn to side 2 for the continuation of this program.
This could be a point at which we will simply go on disagreeing. I don't want to question the reality of the evidence that you're pointing to, and I don't question it, because I surprise many people by talking about my own feelings. I feel I can do that. That really relieves me. And I recognize, who knows what you're going to reveal. I always come back to, this is, I'm now falling back upon my experience as a scientist too, I always come back to the discovery, repeated discovery, that when I give up trying to account for something with an inner entity of some sort, and try very awkwardly at first to deal with external entities which might be responsible for it, that I go through a period when a thing is awkward and obviously I'm talking around a simple statement and so on, and yet in the long run it comes out. I went a long time using the concept of drive, for example, in talking about behavior. Was, I think, the last of the fictions that I dispossessed myself of in my history as a theoretician. And it was awfully awkward to say, instead of saying that this rat has a high hunger drive, to say, well, this rat is at 80% of his body weight, or he's been deprived of food for 24 or 48 hours, something like that. It seems so simple. There's something called hunger, and there it is. Actually, in practice, it is extremely valuable to insist upon the conditions which generate this drive, and this is positivism, of course, but I think it's a very valuable practice. If I could just give you another example on this, I think we're both trying to understand each other here. I'm doing a book at the present time. I don't mind my getting an ad in. I'm doing a book on the technology of teaching. which will not be a long disquisition on teaching machines at all, but an analysis of the processes of instruction from this point of view. And there are certain chapters in there which I think would be of interest because they seem to me to represent a search for the external correlates of the kinds of character traits that we have always assigned to the inner man. Now, you can dispose, I think, of knowledge and skills easily. Those are, I think, fictions. Knowledge of something is only evident when you can talk intelligently about it and so on, and I prefer to talk about the behavior of talking about things than about knowledge. But to take such things as the enjoyment of literature, for example, or an interest in what you're doing, or a dedication or industry or perseveration against the fatigue of excessive work and so on, or courage, doing something in the face of aversive consequences. These things are very easily assigned to personality traits which seem to come with the baby, and people who have them can do these things, and people who don't have them don't do them. The dedicated scientist who is in his laboratory 15 hours a day and so on, he seems to have something, zeal, dedication, which many people don't have, and we give up. We assume that a great many people could never be absorbed in a subject to that extent. Now, you can show, I think, with reasonable certainty on the basis of evidence available now, that the extent to which a person enjoys music or art or literature, books, or the extent to which a person continues to work with a high level of interest in a given field, that these things can be traced to lucky histories of reinforcement. For example, just take enjoying books. Usually a school wants to boast of the level of its students, and so they make the students read books long before they ought to read them. And no one has ever made any reasonable effort to schedule a set of books so that having got a successful result from reading one page and another page and so on, you continue to read and you get periodic satisfactions from this which keep you going. Now, if that is done properly, I'm sure you could build in any individual an extraordinary capacity for enjoying himself with books. And the same thing is true of music and so on. In the case of dedication to scientific zeal, if you want to teach science in the sense of teaching someone to want to be a scientist, this is quite different from teaching him how to use apparatus in a laboratory course. You want to schedule discoveries so that he has the experience of making a discovery the first day when he first tries it. Maybe 2 or 3 days later he makes another, and then 10 days later he makes another one, and we know how to stretch this schedule out so that eventually you've got either on the one hand a pigeon that bats his head against a key at 10,000 times a day for several years, or a scientist who bats his brains out on the walls of his laboratory 16 hours a day for this many years. Now, I can't take a Faraday and say, well, in that case, I can show you the schedule. It may seem ridiculous to interpret Faraday in terms of pigeons, but I can show you people who are reinforced by gambling enterprises on the same schedule who are committed. If you've ever seen a room full of women playing bingo, I don't know why it is that women play bingo, but they have terrific dedication of a sort which American industry would love to be able to command with ordinary wage systems. But the variable ratio schedule in the bingo game is enough to build this extraordinary. They'll sit there 4 or 5 cards and listening to numbers and looking very keenly by the hour. Now, is this something that they're born with? No, it is something which has got into them because of their history of reinforcement. And I would take these words, such as enjoyment, courage, as examples of what you would find in the individual that I am trying to find outside.
Well, that's a very good statement. I think of the possibilities and potentialities of human control that we're coming to, problems which all of us will face and the consequences of which we'll all face. I have, I think, 2 comments on what you've just said. One has to do with the fact that In your talking about your desire to find the external causes of behavior, that is, behavior as viewed externally, you talked in terms that I've heard many people use, where it is as though for every external cause that we can find, then you can drop a previous erroneous internal cause which you formerly posited. I would like to make it clear that's not what I'm talking about at all. I think that that is a part of the advance of science, that things that were formerly dealt with as though they were caused by little homunculi within the individual or various posited internal causes, we do find other types of causation for such behavior. The thing that I would want to stress, and that seems to me has an importance which you give it not at all, is the fact that man does live a subjective life quite as well as being when viewed from a scientific perspective, a sequence of cause and effect. I wondered when you said you often spoke about your feelings, I wondered why. Perhaps it is that you haven't yet found the cause of those or something, but it seems to me there are other reasons for speaking of our feelings. It seems to me that man's subjective life has a significance as a different perspective on life, which stands quite separately and paradoxically in relationship to our view of him as one molecule in a vast chain of cause and effect. And I think that one might say, well, but that's only just a different way of looking at it. It really makes no difference. No, I think that's not true at all. I believe that when the subjective life does seem to have significance, then we adopt different courses of action than we do if we regard it as having no significance at all. And there I'd like to turn to your very good remarks about learning machines. I think that's what they ought to be called rather than teaching machines, don't you?
If I may interrupt, the computer people talk about a machine which learns. It's a machine which modifies itself, and it's because of its own experience. And I think that they have the right then to call it a learning machine.
Okay.
In French, you can use the same word for learn and teach, but you can't in English. And so I think that machine does...
We'll call them teaching machines. It seems to me that depending on whether we give subjectivity any significance, we might use programmed learning in quite different ways. Well, his mathematics are inadequate. If he could go to a program of mathematics at that point to learn what he needs to know, this would be optimal. If he needs to know more about optics, and by that time there are programs along that line, he can take another program, learn that sort of thing. All of it coming at a time when his interest is maximal, his need is maximal. I'm sure the learning would be quick and would be efficient. I think it can lead to the very best of what I would think of as a student-centered type of teaching and learning. Select some slightly more debatable examples. Suppose that he does wish to improve in his appreciation of art. Well, he could easily take a program in art appreciation, which would lead him very much to understand the principles of and appreciate the conventional type of art. He could take a program which would lead him to understand and appreciate some of the things that the abstract painters are trying to achieve. In my mind, that would be excellent, because then he would be faced within himself with the choice of his own values, his own decisions, his own personal appreciation, and where he stood in regard to items of that sort. Or even in the political field, I can think of nothing more really educational than if there was a good program of the principles and benefits of the communist way of life, and a good program on the principles and benefits of a more democratic approach. And if a student had to take both, so that then what he would be faced with would be internal, subjective concern, conflict, difference, which he would have to straighten out within himself. That's the kind of thing that I think I mean when I say that placing some importance on the subjective leads to a different approach than simply shaping up a person's behavior, for example.
I think perhaps I ought to take some time to state how one views experience and this inner life from the point of view of a behavioral science. I don't deny for a moment that each of us has a small part of the universe enclosed within his skin with which he has especially good connections. You can have your toothache, but I can't have it, and this will go for a great many other physiological conditions. Now, in spite of a libel often urged against me, I don't think the organism is empty. I'm sure that all sorts of things go on inside. The only thing I'm concerned with is not having to wait until the physiologists have cleared all of that up to move forward, and I'm sure you would take the same line there. But what is the nature of self-observation in that case? Now, if there are things that go on inside you with which you have a special connection, you might then say, well, those are the things that you will know that no one else can know about you. But will you know them? I've analyzed this problem in my book on verbal behavior and also in that old operationism paper on the ways in which a verbal community can teach the individual to know himself. Now, I can teach a child color if he has color vision by getting him to say red, blue, green, and so on at appropriate times when I'm holding up red, blue, and green, assuming that I have color vision also, or at least I have these labeled, so that, or I can analyze them with a spectrograph or something. In any case, I know something about the stimulus, and I can say to him right or wrong, as he learns the names of the colors. But I can't teach him the names of his emotions in the same way. I can't say, now there, you see, that's diffidence, and this is embarrassment. I may guess correctly that he's feeling diffident and use the word diffident, and he may then use it. What I mean by correct is the way I use it. It's very difficult, and many people have pointed this out, to set up any common vocabulary for the description of inner events. And this would include not only emotional, but sensory events, experiential events, the observation of your own behavioral tendencies, the probability that you will behave in a given way today or tomorrow, what you've done in the past, reporting on your behavior. So that this, although people do come to watch things going on inside them while they are being stimulated, while they are acting in various ways, this always, it seems to me, follows the action or follows the stimulation. It's always something ex post facto. And I would argue that the inner events, which seem so important to us, are not essential to action and probably do not, in any important case, precede action. When I talk about these inner things as fictions, you use the word erroneous. I wouldn't call them errors. I think they are dispensable verbal tools that we could get rid of and profit from being rid of. But when I talk about these, people say, yes, but I can feel my hunger, I can feel my anxiety, I can feel my timidity, and so on. Well, can you? Freud, I think, made an important contribution in the notion of the unconscious. Now, the unconscious, to me, is I'm not bothered by the notion of the unconscious. So far as I'm concerned, conscious and unconscious behavior are all the same. The only distinction being that in the case of conscious behavior, you know what you're doing or why you did it. In the case of unconscious, you don't. In other words, this ex post facto thing can happen in the case of conscious act. It doesn't happen in the case of unconscious. But Freud, I think, showed clearly that the kinds of variables which influence conscious behavior can also be proved to have been responsible for unconscious behavior. So that he freed the causal nature of experience from the need for observation. That is, what happens to you will affect your behavior, whether you know it or not. When you do know it, you say he's conscious. When you don't know it, you say you're not conscious. Freud's evidence isn't conclusive to everyone, but I think we would accept the general principle that there are things we do we don't know we're doing, or we don't know we've done them, or we don't know we're going to do them. There are reasons for acting that we don't know about. There are others we know. Now, if this is the case, then experience will always be something which follows action, or at least a disposition to act, and will not have any causal status. And I would always want to look beyond experience to whatever it is which gives rise to the experience. Your references to education take the line, of course, which Rousseau first portrayed so beautifully in that marvelous book, Emile, which John Dewey and William James and others were advocating at the end of the last century, that you want the student to be interested. If you can make him interested, then he will learn. You suggested that someone might want to build a telescope and would then turn to the proper programs to learn about optics. I'm concerned with his wanting to build a telescope. If this means to you something inside him, which is moving him to build a telescope, then the teaching machine would only apply to showing him how to do this. But I would want to trace his wanting to build a telescope back to earlier events outside him in which he came into contact with telescopes or pictures of telescopes or books about them and stone and so on. The student who wants to learn more about art, you say it's all right to use programmed instruction to teach the student what he wants to know about. But I want to teach him to want to know more about art, and I think that can be done. I think this is not something which arises spontaneously within him, something which comes from his own past history.
I certainly feel all kinds of cognitive remarks I could make about what you're saying, but the thing that suddenly strikes me is that perhaps I could communicate best to you and to the audience by a story that may seem to have no relevance, but I think is quite relevant to this discussion. Just a very short time ago, one of the clients with whom I'm working was trying to tell me how he had always been able to cope with authority in all kinds of difficult situations by just drawing into a nothingness. This was kind of a new learning for him to realize that he had just pulled in and become blank whenever anyone made too many demands on him and so on. As I listened to all of what he was saying, it was much more confused than I've put it. I said to him, I guess the way I'm getting that is that really you had kind of a private joke against the world. No one could possibly defeat you. You could just pull in, and this was your little joke. And he listened for a moment and thought a moment, and then he began to chuckle. And then he broke into really uncontrollable laughter, and he was so embarrassed because he wanted to stop. And I think both of us couldn't help but realize that he was, for the first time, really openly enjoying the joke he had been playing on the world for many years. Now, where does this fit in? Well, for me, it fits in a number of ways. To be sure, we're both of us talking, and I'm talking when I speak about that incident with him, about behavior which had its roots in the past, no question about that. I'm talking about, I guess, the thing that first set off this in mind was you're saying we really couldn't teach a person what to call a feeling. In a sense, that's what part of therapy is, and that's what this was a fairly vivid example of. That he certainly had never thought of himself as playing a joke on life or a joke on the people who tried to control him, and yet when that was put in those terms, it suddenly rang all kinds of inner bells, and he realized that is it, and he broke out, as I say, laughing at the joke he'd always had on life. Now, I don't know whether just by telling a small incident of that kind, I can also communicate the fact that the explanation of that purely from the outside, even though it could be made adequate and complete, is not a complete story of that kind of inner learning which took place in him. And I think here I'm sure we're both being influenced by our own past experience, where Probably you've not had the opportunity to really know what goes on inside the pigeon and rat in the same kind of way that I've had a chance to know what goes on within the human being. But I think that because of that difference in past experience, you stress one dimension only, and it seems to me both dimensions are significant.
Well, let me report my reactions to that story. The phenomenon of escaping from would-be controllers is, of course, very characteristic. The student plays truant. Education has its own word for this, truancy, which incidentally comes from an old word meaning wretched. Religion has its apostasy. Governments have its escapees, its own version of apostasy. Economics have strikes where people refuse to work, although paid, or consumer strikes, they refuse to buy goods at a too high a price, and so on. These are reactions to inept control, and you do this with respect not only to the organized controllers, as I've mentioned, but to the general ethical control in the sense of the control exerted by the group of which you are a member. The hermit is an escapee from social life. The beatnik is a different type of escapee. The inner, drawn-in, withdrawn kind of person is that too. Now, you evidently are working with a person who has resorted to this kind of reaction to control. If he himself first used the words pulled in and became blank without any direction, this would indicate to me that he was at least characterizing his own behavior in this rather metaphorical way. Perhaps you don't want this to be a metaphor, but I do. I think pulling in, I don't know what you do. You're still as large as you were before, but you may be becoming hysterically blind through the environment or just not going to notice things. You are certainly pulling in your world in that you're cutting off reactions to it. Now, the first step in this person's history then would be that he had reacted this way and presumably got him into trouble. That's why he was coming to see you. Now, perhaps you for the first time indicated to him, or in talking with you he indicated to himself, that he was indeed getting away from control by this gesture. He may never have seen why he was doing this. The hermit might not realize that he likes the life of a hermit because nobody's criticizing him or something of that sort. Now he gets an insight, if you like, into the actual negative reinforcement which is leading him to behave in this way. That would be the second step. First, the actual escape from control. Second, the seeing that it is escape. He may very well escape without knowing that he's doing it. Now he sees he's doing it. Now I can't account for the laughter. It might be the suddenness of the realization. I can't account for laughter anyway, so this doesn't bother me. Let us say that in this case it occurred. I suppose it would not inevitably occur in someone who had suddenly realized that he was retreating from society and in doing so escaping from its influences. Some of this might have been known to this individual before he came to you. I'm sure that as he talked with you, he saw more of what he was doing and saw the reasons why he was doing it. But that is, to me, the sum and substance of the gain in the self-understanding in such a case.
Well, I don't know whether this gets anywhere in the intellectual discussion. It really fascinates me, your reaction to this of not wishing to understand any human experience except in highly structured intellectualistic terms. I was particularly intrigued by your reaction to his phrase pulling in, because actually he must have been as large after he pulled in as he was before. True enough, yet how different that is from the kind of things that have been meaningful in my own experience. When a client begins to talk in terms of analogies and fantasies, I realize he's really beginning to get somewhere. The person who is able to speak in really fantasy terms, allegorical terms, terms that are not related to the strict structure of everyday life, this tends to mean that he is thinking significantly and feeling significantly about the deeper meanings of his own life. This person who talks about pulling in and about the blankness that he experienced, I'm sure both of those could be shown to be behaviorally meaningless terms. But as terms descriptive of his own subjective orientation to life, they're extremely meaningful. Somehow in these last remarks of yours, I felt more keenly than I have before, personally, what the difference may be between us. That you are saying all of life, or any particular incident from life, can be neatly packaged, analyzed, and so forth in terms of strictly intellectual terms, which have nothing to do with meaning, which are straight descriptions of outward events. And I guess I feel that's great if you can do it, but I don't believe it. I feel that a point of view that is that narrow runs the same risk as the kind of students we used to see so many of at Chicago, who had committed their whole lives to the feeling that I don't have to feel, I don't have to choose, everything can be worked out rationally, my life is just going to be lived on a completely rational basis. And that's fine, except it doesn't work.
I thought I had agreed as to the existence of these experiences. What I'm objecting to is the assumption of causal efficacy. Now, I know that you shouldn't be held responsible for Freudian psychology, but I'd like to I think the thing I want to point out is clearer with Freud because of the elaborate metaphor which he used to deal with the relation between these inner mental events and the external therapy which he claimed to achieve. I don't believe, and I've talked with good analysts who agree on this, that I don't believe that any evidence is available to establish the temporal sequence between being cured and recalling a traumatic experience. That is, it may be, as the Freudians would have it, on the analogy of excising a tumor, that getting the traumatic experience out of the unconscious works a cure. But it could also be the case that the cure permits the patient to recognize and recall a traumatic experience, so that you are not at all sure that you have excised a cause of trouble, and hence brought about therapy. Now, I think, as I say, I'm not burdening you with that, but I do feel, as in our discussion this afternoon, that you are wanting to order events in such a way that an understanding of one's inner experience comes before the overt, as you would say, consequences of this. You said that when a client begins to talk in terms of analogies or to start reporting fantasies, then he begins to get somewhere. Now, I assume that this getting somewhere means that he does now begin to understand himself, perhaps works out better ways of dealing with the world. If you will permit me to suppose that getting somewhere is capable of a rational description, then I think the issue between us is whether or not one's rational understanding of where he stands in the world follows from irrational, or I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but fantasied glimpses of his own experience, or whether the experiences do not, as a matter of fact, come after some glimpse of the rational fact. And my example of the pulling in took that line. I suggested that the first thing that happened to this client was to understand that in drawing into himself, as he put it, he was indeed escaping from unpleasant aspects of the world around him. He might have done this withdrawing and been able to see that he was doing it without knowing that the main important consequence was that he was freeing himself from aversive stimulation. then I would have said in that case, too, that any metaphor he might use in connection with a joke, perhaps, which in this case was suggested to him, that this would come afterward rather than before an actual understanding of external events. Now, external events, I don't mean sheer behavior, I mean behavior in relation to controlling variables. And he now saw that he was turning away from important things in the environment because in doing so, he reduced the net aversive stimulation in his life. I think we're going to have to either agree to disagree on this point or try to carry it up further, whether I'm raising the question of the relative importance of these experiences, I think, not their existence.
All right. I think, too, one other point that perhaps could be cleared away is that I don't believe that in any fundamental way we differ about the approach one would take to trying to resolve a scientific question. For example, I am much interested in what does really produce change in psychotherapy. I have certainly played with all kinds of hypotheses, including psychotherapy being possibly operant conditioning, all kinds of different hypotheses. And there, we would both agree this would be an empirical fact. I mean, you could set up studies which probably would gradually throw light on what that is and what the causes of change might be. I don't believe we differ as to the kind of approach we would take in getting a scientific answer to a particular puzzle. I don't mean to make a large issue of this because I think this would get us astray, but it is my own hypothesis that experience precedes insight, and I gathered you were saying the other way around. That is, I think when this person burst out in uncontrollable laughter, he was really appreciating and experiencing the satisfactions of tricking all his controllers, to use your terminology, and that as a consequence of that experience, he now later on would be able to put into words that kind of insight. Again, that's an empirical fact. It could be the other way around. One other comment, too, that I would like to make is that it seems to me that you're still believing that when I speak of subjective experiences, inner experiences, and so on, that I'm talking about them as a cause of something external. In other words, that I've sort of brought in some outside little force to operate. That isn't the meaning I give to it. The subjective experiencing of man, in my estimation, is a preceding dimension. It is a dimension which precedes any of our scientific desires, scientific activities, scientific behavior. It is, in my estimation, a more primitive fact than our scientific behavior. But I don't bring it in as a little gadget to produce causal explanations. That's not true. I'm thinking of this as a significant dimension of life, which, as I say, is more primitive, more basic, is the aspect of life to which we turn to see whether we regard one approach to science as better than another, as a matter of fact, or whether we regard this or that as better. And that as a part of our subjective life and experience, we have gradually developed a most marvelously complex set of rules against deceiving ourselves, and we call that science. And I have a great deal of respect for that, and I think we move significantly along scientific lines, but I think it will be unfortunate if that narrower perspective of science blinds us to the fact that we are also, and most basically, subjective beings.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward the cassette to the end, and then turn to side 2 for the continuation of this program.
And I think we move significantly along scientific lines, but I think it will be unfortunate if that narrower perspective of science blinds us to the fact that we are also, and most basically, subjective beings.
Well, I think this is going to remain a difference.
I suspect it will.
you have some very powerful and important authorities on your side. There's been considerable revival of interest in the personal aspects of science. Professor Bridgman, before he died, used to argue this. I've spent many an hour trying to explain to him how one might deal with the question of whether the green he sees is not the red I see, and so on. And he went to his grave not knowing the answer to that and being very much worried about it. He viewed very highly this, put on his book on personal science. I think this is the wrong tack. I don't think science is the experience of scientists at all. I think it is a corpus of procedures and practices. I should hate to think that physics is in any sense what goes on in the mind of a physicist. It is what physicists have done and what they can do. And a series of marks which belong to conventional languages which permit other people to do things, including to talk about them quantitatively and so on. If experience seems very immediate and valuable and important, I think this is another consequence of the fact that I pointed out that each of us has a bit of the universe inside his skin, and he's in good touch with it. If I teach a child the meaning of the word toothache, I've got to know when the child has a toothache. If I'm a dentist and I am probing around and the child jumps and so on, I say, now there you are, that's a toothache. Or if the child comes in and does this and his jaw is swollen and so on, I say, well, you have a toothache. Now, the evidence of the dentist is the sight of a tooth with a certain cavity and a bit of steel striking it. And the sight of what I see is a hand against a jaw. Those are the mediating stimuli that enable me to teach the child the meaning of the word toothache. But the child is getting a very powerful stimulus from the tooth itself. And forever after, that is what the child means by toothache. This is so very much more important than the external criteria that the community has used to teach him this term. Now, where there are powerful stimuli of that sort, they naturally take control of the word. What the word describes to the child is the actual painful stimulus and not a hand with the jaw. But in the case of human behavior and in the case of a lot of other things, where we have to work with a great variety of external stimuli with no very strong internal counterparts, the terms continue to refer to what is evident to the community. And this is, I think, generally true of the language which describes our own behavior. We learn this when it is overt, broad enough in scope, so that people can say, yes, you are now lifting your hand, you are now saying the word now, and so on. But later, you can lift your hand without moving a muscle, and you can say a word to yourself, moving only very small muscles, or perhaps none at all, and you will describe this. You say, yes, just a moment ago, I said something to myself, and I can close my eyes and see this room reasonably well now, and I'm perfectly frank in telling it that I'm doing that. Something is going on, which was going on when my eyes were open, and I can report on that. But this becomes less impressive as something different from what happens with my eyes open. So that I feel in general that while those who deal with experience are likely to make a great deal of the inner stimulation, that those of us who deal with behavior are much more likely to talk about the common elements available to the verbal community as well as the individual. So naturally, I want to minimize the ache and the toothache and deal with an operational definition of toothache. Now that means maybe awfully silly because toothaches we know about them and they're very important and powerful. But operational definitions describing one's own behavior, one's moods and so on, I think are quite different, and I would prefer myself to remain in general at the level of behavior without denying for a moment that something is going on when I am angry with someone, which I can react to as I react to a toothache, although I would still want to define anger in terms of the damage committed upon others and so on. I want a behavioral definition of anger, although I grant that in many cases, reasonable consistency would be obtained in asking one to describe bright and dull pressures in his chest, as they did in the old days.
But I guess that desire for a behavioral description of anger would scarcely apply when you are angry.
Would not have when I was young. Now, as a scientist, it would very much. I wouldn't have known how to describe the behavior when I was a child, and I would have picked up the word anger and would tie it on to a certain marked but not too consistent stimuli generated by my autonomic nervous system, among other things. Now, I would definitely want to define anger in such a way that I could describe my angry acts or see anger in my acts when this was absolutely anesthetic. If I have said anything today because it would hurt you, then if I have not seen this, I lack scientific insight and not knowledge of my feelings. I confess that I have not felt angry towards you at any time today. I think someone could prove to me that I have used an example or a slight figure of speech or something as a dirty dig. Now, that would be an objective behavioral definition of anger, and I would put more faith in anyone's proof that I have been angry toward you than I would in any evidence from my own inner feelings.
Well, that's exceedingly interesting, isn't it? I guess there I don't understand the laughter either. I am trying to make sense of that, and I'm not quite sure whether you're saying when you experience anger now, what you feel is, or what your subjective process is, I'm having some autonomic reactions directed towards so-and-so. Is it really that intellectual?
No. In general, certain kinds of behavior patterns are accompanied by autonomic discharge. It's not always emotional. Strong exercises, too. This thing that we call anger, which I would want to define as a predisposition to harm or damage and so on, it's a behavioral definition, is, I am sure, often accompanied by stimulation, which is relatively consistent, and so that I might, without moving at all and without being aware of any actual impulse to act in any way, report that I feel angry. Perhaps you might give me an injection of Ritalin or something like that. On the other hand, I think that the one thing that Freud has done is to make us examine our acts, not to discover our feelings, for we didn't have any, they were unconscious, but to discover the consequences which were influential in determining our behavior. And this I would take to be a behavioral analysis of an emotion. All unconscious behavior has got to be that by definition, because you don't have any conscious counterpart.
Well, I'll have to mull this over. I'm really trying very hard to find out whether you are aware of living subjectively, and it seems to me you've said things on both sides of that, and I really don't feel quite sure. For your sake, I would hope so, but
Well, I would hope so. If you mean by this that I have learned to observe certain states of my own body, perhaps to discuss them with some consistency in connection with my behaviors and so on, report to you that I enjoy listening to Wagner and what I'm doing when I'm listening to it and so on, yes, this I do. I live a very emotional life, I suppose, in that sense. But the thing that interests me about my emotions is not that. I expect to go on enjoying life that way. The thing that I'm concerned with is my emotion in the sense of my disposition to act this way or that with respect to various states of affairs. And I have many times gone back and looked at something I wrote and been shocked to discover the emotionally loaded words in this. I was not aware then, and I can't believe now that I felt that way about anybody, and by feeling that, all I mean is that I was inclined to damage people this way. If this is a discovery of any stimulation in here or wherever it is, I don't know where it is. People's authorities have differed over the years. I think it's a very trivial thing for me to discover that I am angry in that sense. I think it's very important to me to discover whether or not my behavior with respect to people at large is angry behavior. And that seems to me to be practically unconnected with what's going on inside me. Now, I can enjoy being angry at someone, and I can enjoy lots of better emotions than anger, and I hope to go on doing so. And in this sense, I live in a life of experience, of course.
in that, then, I would share all those feelings with you, because I think I, too, live a life of feelings, and sometimes regret them, and often enjoy them, and so on. Part of what I've been trying to say, certainly, is that subjective feeling life, which to be sure, then we can step outside of ourselves and look at. But the subjective feeling life itself is an exceedingly important part of being human. And I see no reason for being apologetic in regard to it. I feel that it gives dimension and perspective to our more objective views. To leave that for a moment, because before we get completely beyond it, I'd like to go back to some of your comments about science, which interested me a great deal. And if I understood that correctly, you really do see scientific knowledge as a corpus of external fact which kind of exists regardless of you, me, the physicists, or anyone else, sort of out here in semantic space. I think that one of the efforts of science can't help but be to achieve such a body of truth which is separate from any individual and so on. And yet it seems to me that the actual pursuit of science is a highly personal thing, governed by subjective decisions in which subjective choices determine what we will study, determine the methods we use, determine the kind of meanings that we draw from it. Now, when enough people draw similar meanings from similar experiences, we say that seems to be a pretty well verified scientific fact. But I still think it rests on a subjective base. One thing that has always interested me, I don't think I've ever tried to put it into words, and I'm not quite sure how this will come out, is that as I watch clients who move a good deal in therapy, it seems to me that as they approach a better adjustment, they have, in a sense, learned to live a subjective science. I don't know whether this will seem like a complete contradiction in terms, but what I mean by that is that as the person becomes more open to what is going on within himself, he has better data on which to act, his hypotheses are more likely to be confirmed by his experience, he is in a curious way living out the very best of science on an internal, subjective basis in regard to the events going on within him, the hypotheses he draws from those, and the consequent behaviors upon which he acts. That's something that has always intrigued me.
Well, we were getting along famously there for a minute or two. I was admitting that I enjoyed my experiences and you were enjoying yours. That was fine until you start making them responsible for choices and decisions. Now you start making them do something, you see. And they don't do anything. They're the result of doing something. I think when a person is making a decision, he is undoubtedly working on himself, but through the environment or through an internalization of action which was first learned in the environment, and that he will afterward feel the rightness of a choice or decision perhaps, but that this is something which follows. And if I were to teach someone how to make decisions, I would not naturally try to teach him this inner life. I would teach him the external, mathematical, statistical, whatever it would be, procedures you go through in arriving at the most likely decision in a given set of circumstances. Now, what is happening when you make a lightning decision, I don't think you or I know that. Either as inner or external data that things happen so fast that it's not likely to follow it. I would insist on my distinction about the causal efficacy. I don't mean for a moment that a person who has arrived at a decision about his own life doesn't then feel a decision. He feels it is right, he feels what he's now going to do, and so on. But I would want to go as far as possible in asking whether or not the essential ingredients there were not the environment and his self-controlling, self-managing manipulations of the environment.
I feel various responses to that, but you were kind enough to give me the first statement this afternoon, and I see by the clock our time is really up, so I'll give you the last word in the discussion today.
Dr. Rogers has kindly offered to let me start first this time, since I let him do that yesterday. I hope this is symbolic of a continuing effort to deal fairly with each other in this protracted interview. I want to make 2 points in my opening remarks this morning. One, I want to respond to Dr. Tamanen's hardly veiled hint that we ought to start talking about education pretty soon. And I want also to try to make progress in coming to some understanding with Dr. Rogers about the techniques which we severally espouse in arriving at what I'm sure are very similar goals. It seems to me that the main issue which developed yesterday concerned the question of inner experience and its place in human behavior. And the conference has been very well designed, I think, to permit some kind of intellectual progress to go on. I'm going to try to state my case as clearly as I can and hope that after Dr. Rogers has made his remarks, we can attempt to see whether there is a basic disagreement here or whether we are, in some sense, talking about the same thing. I want to examine 3 cases from the analysis of education which have to do with supposed inner events relevant to what is necessarily an external process of instruction. Now, I don't hold Dr. Rogers responsible for any one of these, but I have to regard him as a fellow traveler in the sense that the points I'm going to bring up seem to me to exemplify an effort to account for behavior by isolating the originating event as something to do with inner experience. I want to take the 3 educational problems of teaching knowledge, verbal knowledge or skill, teaching thinking, and teaching some of the personality traits which I did mention in passing yesterday. Now, the first one of these has to do with the meaning of verbal behavior. I've written a rather long and I'm told very difficult book which attempts to account for verbal behavior on the part of the speaker and responses to verbal stimuli on the part of the listener without invoking the notion of meaning or the earlier notion of idea or proposition or the more recent notion of information. These 3 terms, the older notion of the meaning of a proposition, the idea expressed in words, or the more recent one, information, the information conveyed by a remark, these all seem to me to make a fundamental mistake in supposing that there is some kind of cognitive activity which is not itself verbal, which happens before verbal behavior, and the verbal behavior becomes simply the symptom or symbol, words meaning the same thing actually, of the inner activity. Now, to take a nonverbal example first, there is the old joke of the difference between a man racing for a train and a man training for a race. Physiologically, they're both doing the same thing. How do they differ? Now, if you believe in meaning as something which characterizes behavior, and I suppose someone like Tolman would have done so, then you would have to suppose that their behaviors are not identical. They may be physiologically, but one of them is possessing the meaning of catching a train, and the other one is possessing the meaning of improving himself for a future race. Actually, I look for that difference, not in the behavior, which I think is the same in both cases, or could be at least, but in the variables which are responsible for the behavior. In one case, there is a different history, and what Tolman would call a different purpose involved. Now, purpose is another one of these inner things, which, as a matter of fact, Dr. Rogers mentioned as something which had no meaning for behavioristic analysis. I think, in a sense, it has a very great meaning, and I have tried to suggest that by apologizing for the frequency with which I talk about reinforcement by pointing out that it is nothing more than another way of talking about purpose. The only difference being that it identifies the characteristic moment at which an event is important. In the evolution of behavior, if you say a spider is building a web in order to catch flies so that the spider will survive and perpetuate its kind, it looks as if the future catching of flies in the web had something to do with the building of the web. Now, actually, I think a biologist would agree that that is the wrong order of events, and that the purpose of the web lies in the past. That is, spiders which have in the past built effective webs have found a supply of food, which has meant that they have survived with the behavior, and it's an inherited behavior pattern, I'm quite sure in that case, which was responsible for that supply of food. So that in the biological evolutionary scheme of things, what seems to be the future purpose of an event is actually a reference to past instances. And this is true in the case of operant behavior also, because what I'm doing now, in order to have an effect on you, can hardly be determined by the effect which I have not yet had. But it is determined by the effects I've had in the past, which have shaped my verbal behavior in various ways, and you are, of course, going to shape my behavior in the next 5 or 10 minutes. I'm perfectly willing to accept the point of the joke about the rat who points out that he has me well controlled. I think that any science is eventually shaped as a human activity by its subject matter. The man designing a cyclotron designs it precisely so that certain events will happen in it in a given way, and if he doesn't do that, his cyclotron will be discarded and someone else's will survive. So these feelings that you have that the meaning of what you're doing, the purpose of what you're doing is very important, are genuine enough. If I ask some man, what are you running for? He says, I'm running to catch a train. This doesn't mean to me that he is aware of his purpose in anything except the sense that he is aware of the conditions under which he is running, and, of course, the condition which will bring that running to an end. He observes this, has observed it in his past. And in analyzing the teaching of verbal knowledge, I think it is very important to understand that you are always concerned with the teaching of behavior and not the ideas expressed in the behavior. Logically, there is no such thing as a proposition apart from all the ways in which the proposition can be expressed. But that's a purely logical statement, doesn't make much sense either. What you do to teach a given idea in depth is to teach it in many ways of speaking. And that is the closest you will ever get to an idea apart from verbal behavior. Some set of conditions which are responsible for a whole cluster of verbal responses. And the difference between rote learning and teaching insightfully is very often just that you teach the thing not as a memorized single verbal response, but as a cluster of responses related to the same variables. Now, the second example, where people have sought something inside a student in order to explain his behavior, and have therefore, to my mind, misinterpreted the object of education. As an example of that, I'll go way back and take the scene in Plato's Meno, in which Socrates pretends to teach the slave boy Pythagoras' golden theorem. Now, Plato was a devotee of the inner life, and felt, as a matter of fact, that the soul knows the truth, and that learning is merely remembering, recollecting perhaps in the sense of reassembling, but in suggesting that the process of education is only bringing out something which is latent in the student. This is still a strong philosophy in education today. Let's examine that case. Socrates wants to prove his point that any human organism knows a very difficult proposition, the doubling of the square. He calls a boy in and goes through a ritualistic procedure which is highly Socratic in its essence. He first of all constructs a square and says to the boy, this is a square, isn't it? The boy says yes. If I do this, it divides into 2 parts, doesn't it? The boy says yes, and so on. And he goes on this way, and this example is still cited today as proof of a way of teaching insightful understanding of mathematical theorem with the general pattern of drawing the solution out of the student. Now, I went to the trouble once of having the boy's comments copied out of that passage in the Meno, and when you put them together, they run exactly 1 minute. I don't have the sheet with me. I didn't know this case would come up. The whole set of responses of the boy goes something like this. Yes, certainly Socrates. Quite right, Socrates. No, of course not Socrates. Yes, you're undoubtedly right, Socrates, and so on. And when he gets through, there is no effort made to show whether the boy can go through this again, and I'm perfectly sure he could not. He has done nothing but agree to Socrates. This is one of the great frauds of educational literature, and it is still cited as an example of how one can draw truth out from the inside experience of the student. This is still the theory back of many current mathematics curricular programs, that you must get the student excited, and you must get him to discover for himself. And the implication is that you don't know until you have discovered for yourself. If something you've discovered yourself, you will remember better. Well, I have no doubt that in the hands of a good teacher, this kind of Socratic technique can stimulate interest, curiosity, and perhaps even effort and industry on the part of the student. But when you analyze what is happening in that case, it comes back to the behavioral manipulation that I've been talking about. There's been never any demonstration that I would subscribe to that we do all possess Euclid in ourselves in some latent form, and that we can be led to discover it for ourselves. Men discovered geometry. Euclid, I suppose, brought together a long history of discovery and put it in a book. It was a difficult thing. To suppose that we must do it all over again before we know geometry is, I think, a very inefficient way to approach education. I've seen a 7th grade teacher trying to teach grammar to a class in just this way. Now, the Greeks discovered grammar, too, and it was a great discovery, and it must have taken a great deal of time. Why a 7th grade class must go through all of that again on its own, I don't know. But this teacher was starting, he had a sentence written on the board. He was trying to get the students to say, that's a thing word and that's an action word. The boys who spoke up and said noun and verb or shush, they were told that mustn't use those words. Let's find out about this for ourselves. And for a long class period, the students struggled toward the recognition of 2 types of words, which turn out then to be called nouns and verbs. Now, this may have some motivating effect, although I can think of much better ways of motivating children. I think there is nothing about grammar that you cannot understand unless you have discovered it for yourself. Now, a third example would be some of the character traits that I talked about yesterday as examples, again, of behavior which we like to attribute to something inside the organism. I mentioned the enjoyment of art, music, literature, one's interest in what one does, and so on. But someone brought up last night the question of emotional conditioning, and I'll take one example which involves that. There are some children who can take punishment without crying. They seem to be particularly brave. Who can take novel experiences without panicking. Now, how can we bring this about? Is there something called courage, which is born into some of us and not into others, so that we must give up on this? Or could anyone be given these traits of character? Rousseau, in the book I've already mentioned, Emile, which is a remarkable treatise on human behavior, probably fundamentally wrong, but nevertheless a most ingenious book for its time, Rousseau suggests ways in which you could teach children to take strongly aversive stimuli without emotional reactions. He begins with the idea of the cold bath water, which will make a baby cry. He says, begin on the first day with water at body temperature, and then reduce the temperature every day. And he says, use a thermometer. We're going to be scientific about this. You bring the temperature down 1 degree every day. And eventually you're plopping the baby into ice water, and the baby takes this perfectly well, is not disturbed by it at all. Now, you may not call it an emotion, that is the ability to take something which an ordinary child who has not been through that course in history would not be able to take, and who might be timid, who might be craven, cowardly all his life. But Rousseau also took the case of a much more emotional example. He tells about the story of Hector and Andromache and the baby who was frightened by his father's war helmet as he says farewell to him. And he raises the question of why it is that small children can be frightened by ugly masks or faces. And he suggests that you construct a whole series of masks going from a very pleasant face to a perfectly terrifying face by very small steps. You first of all work with a baby one day with a pleasant face on, then you slowly move into this, and he's never been disturbed at any time by this very frightening spectacle, but is now not emotionally disturbed by it. Now, I believe that we've seriously neglected emotional training in our educational systems. People object violently to that scene in Walden 2 in which the children are supposed to wear lollipops around their necks but not to touch them with their tongues during the day and so on. But I would like to see a little more moral and ethical self-control taught. This can be done, I'm sure, so that everyone will be a brave man and a brave woman who will be able to take necessary painful stimuli without flinching and so on, who will not be much disturbed by what otherwise would be terribly emotional circumstances. This would include periods of failure, periods of frustration, periods of otherwise great unhappiness. Now, I've taken these three examples: the meaning of a verbal proposition, the thinking through of a problem in, say, mathematics, and a character trait. These are all areas in which the natural tendency is to suppose that this individual who is marked by this possesses something inside himself which is very important. The person who knows it, he's got it in here. He can talk about it, yes, but when he isn't talking about it, it's in here. Well, I'm sure it's in here, too, in some physiological condition. And I'm sure that the person knows very often whether it's in there or not. But he's got it in there because it's been put in. Knowledge has been implanted, not drawn out. Many people misunderstand the meaning of the word educate, dukery, drawing something out from inside the student. Knowledge is implanted, and our job as educators is to implant behavior, or to shape behavior, or to build it up and to strengthen it, rather than to try to find it already in the student and draw it out. Now, I don't deny for a moment the existence of these things which one can see when one looks at oneself and reports on whether he's afraid or not, whether he is getting the point of this problem or not, whether he sees the point of an explanation of a theorem and so on. I'm sure this goes on. The question between us is not one of the existence of the inner events, but their status as explanatory, efficacious causes of the overt behavior which it seems to me to be the business of education to set up. One other quick point here. When you put a student into a difficult situation, one which might frighten him, but it doesn't because he controls himself, one which might puzzle him, but it doesn't because he solves the problem, and so on, one which might show him up to be ignorant, but it doesn't because he comes through with the answer. When you do this sink or swim technique of creating a situation in which a child or a student must be knowledgeable, insightful, and brave, you leave it up to the individual to solve his own instructional problems, and that has been the regular trend in education. On the other hand, and when he does solve them, in the rare case, you admire him. You admire Abraham Lincoln for getting an education, although no one taught him. You don't admire Franklin Roosevelt for getting an education at Harvard because Harvard taught him. There is nothing to admire if the educational system is powerful enough to produce these results in everyone. The only point of admiring is to make up for the deficiencies of your education. I would prefer a world in which everyone got an education without trying very hard. If we don't have that world, I will share in your admiration for a man who gets an education against great odds. But the difference is that the reasons for admiring will disappear in an effective world. We'll miss that, but it's something we've got to learn to get along without.
Dr. Skinner told me that he got up early this morning. I didn't know he got up that early. And so did I. I feel in regard to all that he has been saying, I'm not quite sure who it is he's talking to, but somehow he's not talking to me. I mean that quite seriously, as so often happens probably, where differences are quite real and quite deep. It's very difficult to prevent communication from sliding off center and talking past each other. I really have no particular response to what he has just said because, as I say, I really don't feel that he is talking to the kind of issues I feel. Instead, I'm compelled or feel impelled to give a speech of mine too. Probably the real reconciliation, the real making of this into a dialogue may come later in this hour, or perhaps it can only occur in you. I'm not sure. We'll have to see. When I thought about yesterday's session, I felt that because the topic was one of control of behavior, my own remarks tended rather necessarily to be critical and anti. That's not too characteristic of me. I'm more a person who affirms than who criticizes. And so I felt a little unhappy about that. And I thought that perhaps to offset that, I'd like to make a few remarks about the design of a culture, to use Dr. Skinner's good phrase, as I see it. Also, I will bring in the matter of education, but I'd like to bring it in within that context. I think what part of my purpose in doing this is to indicate that when one does place a value on the subjective aspects of experience, then when one designs a culture, one takes different directions than if one does not value that. The thing that specifically got me to thinking about this was Wendell Johnson's very good challenge to us and to you that perhaps one of the first things we should do was to point out the differences between pigeons and persons. That somehow had real meaning to me. I think that persons do have a capacity for awareness. We have this rich capacity for symbolization, which to my mind is probably synonymous with awareness. We have a capacity for a rich subjective living. We have a capacity for something I like to think of as an organismic valuing process. That is, that we are able to test objects and events in terms of our own experiencing as to the values they have for us in enhancing us or being destructive in our experience. Those are a few of the capacities which persons have. I think most of those pigeons have relatively little capacity for, except the last, and on that we might learn from them. I'd like to talk a little bit about designing a culture which would maximize the truly human qualities and attempt to build a culture for persons, not for pigeons. I'd start out on this basing my remarks on some of the research that we've done in psychotherapy, because I am, to some degree, a scientist. I was a little amused last night to think of myself only as an overwhelmed practitioner. I have had some experience with the scientific side as well. I think that some of the studies that have been completed in the realm of psychotherapy indicate that we know something of the kind of psychological climate which would promote and maximize the most truly human qualities. We've begun to specify some of the elements of that psychological climate. We know that when a person is prized as a person, valued as a person, this helps. We know that when the personal meanings which he finds within his own experience are deeply understood by another so that they are confirmed in him, this too is a quality of the psychological climate which can release the human qualities. We know that when he comes into a genuine subjective encounter with other real persons, this too is an element which helps to release. I think that in the kind of culture I would be in favor of designing, that parents and teachers and others could be helped by trying to establish such conditions in the life situation of the persons with whom they deal. Now, we certainly expect and wish to discover more of the elements which would have that kind of releasing quality. Our goal in such studies and in such research would be to find the conditions which would increase the capacity for personal choice, increase the capacity for self-direction, increase the capacity for spontaneity and creativity, for independence, for flexibility, would increase the tendency which Wendell Johnson described so well last night as being toward personal scientific living, that is, living in terms of scientific principles within one's own personal and subjective life. I suppose that you could say that, in short, we would, by establishing these conditions, tend to bring about in individuals the likelihood that these persons could not be shaped up by controllers. I think, again, part of the panel discussion last night was quite accurate in my view in that respect. Now, a word or two about the application of those ideas to the educational situation. I feel that I have, on a number of occasions, endeavored to try to establish those conditions as a learning climate for students. And I haven't always been successful. I feel that there's a good deal we do not know about the kinds of conditions that really do release freedom in people. And yet, when one has been able to set the psychological climate which enables individuals to become more free in choosing their purposes, more self-directing toward their goals, that they tend to feel a greater reliance on their own initiative, the results are sufficiently exciting and sufficiently compelling from an achievement point of view that one can't rest quietly without trying to advance that field further. It is, I think, that we are talking here of something which can be empirically measured and studied, that the kind of educational climate which I would hope would be created in this culture we might design for persons would be such as to enhance and promote self-directed learning. It doesn't mean going back to have to struggle step by step through all that the Greeks learned centuries ago. It means a following through of one's current purposes using all of the modern resources available. But it does mean doing that on a self-chosen, self-directed, self-initiated basis. I think that kind of an education would not achieve static goals which we could define in advance. What it would achieve would be the development of changing persons with a greater degree of self-confidence in directing themselves. To my mind, this is something that the modern world very badly needs. Quite another way of talking about what I'm describing is that as I see some of these developments, the whole philosophy of democracy and its stress upon self-determination and so on has thus far made very slight progress in the world. We have established it a little bit in the political realm, and it has begun to show slight pervasiveness in other areas. But the thing I'm talking about is extending the philosophy of democracy down to individual life, individual learning, group and family living, and so on, where it would be not only the worth of the individual, but his capacity and right for self-determination and choice, which would be important. Obviously, the kind of thing I'm talking about would not produce a closed society. No one could possibly plan this in advance as a closed book. What it would produce would be an open, changing kind of society. Change and the process of change would be built into it. This, too, I think, is valuable. By developing a society in which parents and teachers and all of those in positions of leadership, whether government or otherwise, were skilled in providing the conditions which make for personal growth, we would have a society in which variability and individual self-actualization would take place. We would have individual persons developing uniquely with a sense of personal freedom and freely seeking solutions, each one to the problems that were real to him, as well as seeking solutions to the problems of his society. In this kind of a culture which I'm talking about, every citizen would be a responsible planner. Every citizen would be a member of the elite. Every citizen would be a Fraser, not just one somewhere in the background. Thus, the likelihood of the society being a living, changing flow of intelligent encounter with the problems faced in the world would be greatly enhanced. We would have initiated a process of continuing and self-directed change, not a community with static goals established by one person or established by an elite. I think it would be very clear that, to me, the most important task of the behavioral sciences is to discover and to endeavor to establish the conditions which release variability, release creative behavior and self-directedness, thus making the individual less predictable and less likely to be controlled. And I think that this is just as feasible a goal for the behavioral sciences as to establish a planned control. Well, end of speech.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward the cassette to the end, and then turn to side 2 for the continuation of this program.
I want to raise one other little incident that would get us back to the place of inner experience, which was the topic that Mr. Skinner opened up on. One of the stories that I've heard, I don't know whether it's true, but if it isn't, it should or could be true, is that one of the people who was early investigating the operant conditioning of verbal behavior made a very convincing presentation of this to his students, and they conducted research and showed that you could condition the verbal behavior of individuals and so on. So his students thought it would be fun to operantly condition him. So he had a certain gesture that he tended to use somewhat, and they all agreed, okay, when he uses that gesture, we'll nod or smile or look especially attentive. We'll reward him for that behavior. We will condition his behavior to increase the gesture. And so they did that, and it worked. More and more he began to use this particular gesture that they were rewarding. So that when they felt they had him sufficiently conditioned, they told him about their little experiment and all had a good laugh together. Now, the point that for me is crucial is that once the instructor realized that he was being manipulated by these rewards, they would no longer operate as rewards. I don't know precisely how he would perceive them, probably as being a little bit depreciating of himself. At any rate, it's perfectly clear that though all of the external behaviors might remain exactly the same, they might decide to go on operantly conditioning this gesture, but the rewards would no longer be effective. Why? Because of a change in the subjective perception of the instructor as to what constitutes a reward. And no longer would this head nodding and smiling and so on be perceived as a reward. Well, it's that kind of thing that I think we need to include in our world of science.
First, let me clear up that anecdote. There are actually two cases blended together here. In one of them, I shaped the behavior of a psychiatrist who was participating in a round table and who was, I thought, talking a little too much for good communication. I passed a slip of paper down the table to a friend of mine saying, watch Dr. X's left hand. I'm going to shape a chopping response. So it just happened that Dr. X was across the table from me and talked mainly at me. And he tended to gesture a great deal. So I simply looked to one side, so out of the corner of my eye, I could see pretty much his general posture. Whenever his left arm was up, I looked at him, but dead tan. And whenever his left hand went down, I nodded. And within 5 minutes, he was holding out of his wristwatch. The note came back, let's see you extinguish it. And I must confess I wasn't able to. The other story, which I think is in part of this apocryphal story you've just heard, is that I, some time ago, gave a series of lectures at a Midwestern college, and a professor at the college who had read Joseph Wood Crouch and other similar authors was enraged that I had been asked to speak.
and opened up the week that I was in residence there by telling his class that I was a menace, and that so long as I stayed in an ivory tower, all would be well, but that if I ever showed any signs of having a practical effect, he would be in favor of calling out the firing squad. Well, the students in his class resented this a little and did plan this particular trick. They agreed that they would first of all reinforce him for coming over and standing on the right-hand corner of the platform. And when they had achieved that, they would then reinforce him for going back and facing the blackboard. They did this just by all being very deadpan until he moved in that direction, and then they began to smile and agree with him. And very soon he was teetering on the corner of the platform. Then the signal went out, but that was enough of that. He teetered a while, but they were all deadpan. When he turned back toward the board and looked at us, they were all nodding again. And they tell me, I wasn't there, they tell me that he finished the lecture facing the blackboard, talking over his shoulder. Now, in neither case, to my knowledge, has the control person in that case ever learned what happened, and I should not like to think of the consequences, because it is certainly true that once you discover that these characteristic social reinforcers have been used for a purpose, doesn't build your resistance against them. The backslapping Dale Carnegie fellow who's out to make you his friend and influence you doesn't get very far if you have read Dale Carnegie also. But it is not true that reinforcers don't work, and I don't know of anyone who has not been to some extent reinforced by flattery, even though he knew the ulterior purposes of the flatterer. The gambler, the pathological gambler, knows all too well why he is gambling. If he studied book schedules of reinforcement, he's the victim of a variable ratio schedule. He cannot, for that reason, stop it. The social reinforcement of approval, a smile, and so on can be destroyed if you discover that the person who uses these is out to control you, because that does devalue the reinforcer. But when the reinforcer has a stability, as money has, you may know very well that it's being used to control you and still suffer control. Now, I want to tell another...
Could I comment on it? Because I think that it's extremely interesting to think through this issue, that a theory of human behavior, which is effective only when it can be, or mostly effective, only when the operation of that theory can be concealed from those on whom it is operating, that seems to me to be a relatively unsatisfactory theory of human behavior. For example, the persons in Walden 2 became aware of the planning and so on that had gone into it, and if to that extent it would destroy the effectiveness of many of the reinforcers, then somehow that's not a very complete or effective theory of behavior. This has been one of the things that has perplexed me, and I'm interested that Dr. Skinner agrees on that. On the other hand, in another field, it has always interested me that there are some theories of psychotherapy, for example, George Kelly's procedures in therapy being one, which operate effectively only if the client is quite unaware of the theory that the therapist is acting upon and the principles he's trying to promote. Now, it has seemed to me to be of interest that in the kind of approach that makes sense to me in therapy, the more the individual knows of the climate I would like to create, of the principles that seem to me to be operative, the more intelligently he can participate in the experience of therapy. And it seems to me the same thing would be true in the culture that I was trying to describe, that the more the individual realized the basic principles we were after, the more he realized the theory of what was happening, the more intelligent and probably the more enthusiastic would be his participation in that culture. I must say that for me that is one reason for feeling that it is a more potent or widely usable theory, that it is not destroyed by people becoming aware of what's happening.
I'm afraid I didn't make my point. The reason that discovering that someone is flattering you insincerely leads to a counter-controlling action on your part is not that there's anything wrong with the notion of reinforcement, but that that particular reinforcer has been devalued. if I am paying...
Subjectively, would you say?
No, I wouldn't, actually. A piece of money, a dollar bill, has reinforcing effect, power, value, because it is exchangeable, let us say very crudely, for immediately reinforcing goods of one kind or another. Now, if the money devalues, if that bill becomes worthless, it will no longer reinforce. But that doesn't raise any objection to its reinforcing effect when it had this particular value. And the thing which devalues it is that it is no longer exchangeable for our primary reinforcers. I don't know of any case in which knowledge of the process of reinforcement does destroy its effect. If someone is insincere in his compliments, the effect is destroyed, just as the effect of money as a reinforcer is destroyed in an excessive inflation. I myself work for a living, although I know perfectly well that I'm being reinforced with money. I came out here because I'm getting reinforced. I still came. In fact, I'm very delighted to be here. If you're trying to reduce or control your weight, you're highly aware of the reinforcing effects of various foodstuffs and so on. And although you may be successful in counter-controlling on this, you don't deny that these are reinforcing, and if you don't watch it, they will strengthen certain behaviors of ingestion to the point at which you'll be damaged. This is a common misunderstanding that if you know you're being worked on, it won't work. If you know that the money that's being used to pay you is bad money, it won't work. But that comes about by an extinction of the conditioning process which made it a conditioned reinforcer in the first place.
I am interested in your statement that to the extent that the individual realizes this reinforcer is offered insincerely or something like that, that it would change in value for him. Yet this brings me to something that is a very real feeling reaction that I would like to express. I have a high respect for your sincerity. You seem to me to be a genuinely sincere person. Yet as I watch the way in which your theories are described as working in practice, I get a very different feeling. I was quite perplexed last night to sense the way I was reacting to Professor Tesla's reading of this excerpt from Walden 2. It's been quite a while since I've read Walden 2, so it really did come to me as a fresh thing. And I was genuinely surprised at the revulsion I felt. And I tried to puzzle out afterward why, because what was being described were these group therapy, devotional type exercises, which certainly were innocuous enough in themselves. And I think I realized that the reason I had the reaction I did was that it seems to me that in the world as you would like to see it, nothing is really genuine. Everything has a pseudo quality to it. It is partly, I think, because of your devaluation of the subjective. There's everything real is something different from what it seems to be. That is, for the people in these devotional type exercises, these expressions of loyalty to the code and so on, I assume that for them, those would be experienced subjectively as a real devotion. But only Fraser knows and knew that they were planned that way, that these were not real, that they're nothing but a piece of human engineering designed to keep people in line with the code. And I realized that if an individual in Walden 2 ever realized that, well, the least he would do, I think, would be to stop going to those exercises. So, as I sensed it, the whole society is based on the notion of surreptitious control. And it made me wonder how long a real Walden 2 would last. And if what I hear is correct, this is no idle question, because I have heard that you're really trying to get funds to establish a Walden 2. I would like to throw this in that in spite of your sincerity, which I really trust, it seems to me that the hypothetical worlds you construct are basically insincere. They are not what they seem to be. They are not genuine.
First, I'm glad that you give me an opportunity to comment on Dr. Tesla's comments on Walden 2. They were not designed to warm the cockles of the heart of an author. But I actually planned it that way. There are two things about that book which have to be taken into account, I think, in discussing Fraser. Professor Tesla raised the question of the difficulty a critic has in identifying the author with a particular character. One thing he can do is to ask the author. I am here to say that when I wrote the book, I was in grave doubts about Fraser. I think the book is mainly a struggle between two aspects of my own personality, represented by Burris and Fraser. But when I had given Fraser as a fictional character the chance to say things I didn't dare say myself, it all seemed to me to make sense, and I am now a confirmed Fraserian. Now, this, however, doesn't make that particular passage a strong passage for two reasons. In the first place, Fraser makes this point. I made him deliberately an unpleasant person. And there's a scene in which this whole question is argued out. The whole point here is, as Fraser says, that a person who may, through a scientific analysis, work out a better way of life, may not himself be able to lead that life. He may not himself be the kind of admirable person that particular culture can now produce, because he himself is not a product of it. And as Fraser said, all the things to the contrary, one can arrive at good cultural practices without being able to observe them himself. Fraser has what you might call negative charisma. All great leaders have had charisma. There's personal force. Jesus had charisma. St. Paul had charisma. The other leaders have had a less admirable charisma. They were effective as people. But Fraser is not effective as a person. In fact, Professor Tesla pointed that out. No one knows who he is, and no one knows his part in founding the community. He tries to get a couple of architects to come and explain something to a small group, and they go off swimming instead, and so on. He is not a leader in that sense currently at all, and this was deliberately put into the book, so that his description of their Sunday services was meant to be cynical, meant to arouse the reader to a critical attitude. Then I wrote the book to alert people to the possibilities of a utopia. The main problem, as someone has pointed out, is goes back quite a long time, actually, in critical thinking about utopias. The problem today is not whether they're possible, but how to prevent them. This can be serious. As Dr. Rogers has said, I believe, sincere about this. I'm very much concerned about the possible misuse of a behavioral technology. The other reason that passage is weak is that, as interpreted last night, it brought in the various values which Fraser lists. I had to write a book describing an experiment, and I had to guess at the result of a 10-year run. Now, the point of the book is that all cultures are experimental, or should be. They are experimental whether they're designed to be or not, because they will eventually disappear if they are not strong. But that a properly designed culture should design itself as an experiment so that it can be tested and can change as occasion dictates. And I had to guess at the values which would have emerged at the end of 10 years, and they turn out to be middle-class values. I'm perfectly aware of that. I'm aware of my middle-class status, my middle-class training, and naturally I would go for things like health, wisdom, wealth, comfort, productivity, creativity, and so on. But the passage in which those are discussed directly, I think, presents them in a better light. To begin with, you have to settle on some plan for a community. And Fraser said, to begin with, I prefer health to illness, I prefer wisdom to ignorance, and so on. And I think we could all agree on that without overlooking the fact that there are times when one must decide whether to value health above wisdom and so on. You start a design based upon some of these principles. I don't really think that they are values in the philosophical sense. You have to design for something. You plan for something. And to begin with, you would choose what seems best in our way of life. But under the conditions of an experimental community, you might very well find these things changing. The thing I worry about is that we will be too successful not in regimenting people, but in making them too rambunctious and hard to handle. I'm not sure that I will ever start an experimental community, but if I do, one of the things that would be most challenging would be the total ecological control of the child from birth for the first 5 or 6 years. Those are the great wasted years in our present culture. These sensitive organisms during that period are capable of fantastic achievements and all arrive at the age of 5 or 6 badly messed up. Now that can be done in a different way. It will be done with total control at the beginning on the part of the environment, but it will certainly engender techniques of self-management and self-control so that the environment can relax as the child grows and the child will be on his own. I quite agree with Dr. Rogers that we need to release the inner freedom of the individual, meaning by that freedom from explicit and particularly aversive external controls, so that he does talk to himself, go over plans, review himself as an individual, and so on. And I want to teach him how to do this. These techniques of self-management can be taught and should be taught at a tender age. I sense that Professor Tesla was hoping that the child psychiatrist last night would say that 6 was too early to arrive at ethical maturity, and I'm delighted to say that my colleague in the psychological and psychiatric sciences backed me up, that there's no reason why a child at the age of 6 cannot have arrived at a very effective system of ethical self-management, and I think that is true. It's not too early. We don't know what is too early. That's one of the awful things about one of these inner forces that I'm sure Dr. Rogers would discard as rapidly as I, the whole notion of readiness. The child can't learn to read until he's ready to read, and so on. This is one of the worst of the inhibiting inner experiential, fictional, hypothetical limitations on human behavior. Omar Moore at Yale University has 3.5-year-old children typing on electric typewriters complete sentences using correct fingering, and these are not routine rote-learned patterns at all. They are verbal responses to projected sentences on the screen. 3.5 years old. And these are New Haven, middle-class children. They're not geniuses at all. We have no idea what this very intricate human organism is capable of. I want to give Dr. Rogers a little time to answer this before we stop, but I hope before the morning is over that I can also raise the question of how pigeons differ from people.
I feel that one of the things on which, one of the really basic things on which Dr. Skinner and I agree is in our view of the vast and untapped potentialities of the human organism that have not been fully released or fully developed. And though we might take somewhat different pathways to that, on that score, I think we're in real agreement. I was also intrigued, because I haven't been sure how much he would call it control, I would call it influence, how much influence I might have had on Dr. Skinner. I was intrigued that his statement that if you're going to design a culture, if you're going to design a society, you have to choose certain values to start with. I don't know what he means in his terminology by having to choose certain values, because it was my whole understanding that it was on precisely that point that he felt this was not feasible. I would heartily agree, though, with his statement that we do have to choose certain values, that those precede our attempt to redesign a culture. And I would also hope that we would choose values which in themselves incorporated the whole process of change. This is why I never have been fond of the rather static type of values, whether middle class or otherwise, which are incorporated in Malden too, or in some of Dr. Skinner's writings. And I'd like to change the topic just a bit to bring in one other issue that we haven't touched on and that I would like to bring in. This is the feeling I have that we are very likely to settle for much too narrow a view of the behavioral sciences. This, I think, is one of the real differences between us. I'd like to read very quickly just two statements, one from a psychiatrist and one from a psychologist, that put this in a good way. Dr. Dean, a psychiatrist, says, "Unfortunately, those who make a fetish of scientific method tend to exclude subjectivity from their data because it is not, quote, scientific. For my part, I cannot believe that any study of man which excludes the subjective can be a science at all. At best, it is only a partial science. I should think that a science must include all the data of experience. And when life problems are the subject matter, then the data of subjectivity must bulk exceedingly large. Or Jim Bugenthal in California puts it in terms that are a little too drastic to suit my taste, but still they're meaningful. He says, the behaviorists have shown us the true nature of neurosis, not in what they have taught, but in how they have redefined man to avoid the real danger of adopting much too narrow a perspective when we turn the tools of our science toward the study of man. And I hope that as we try to design cultures, as we endeavor to improve education, as we endeavor to release these potentialities in the individual, we can have a science which takes a look at the whole range of data and at the wholeness of the human being. That's one thing that I have felt increasingly through this discussion I have wanted to say.
I'll just make one remark before we break. I do not, I believe, exclude anything from my considerations. I thought that I had several times acknowledged the existence of events within the individual with which that individual has an especially intimate contact. I confess to having feelings and so on. I confess to their importance in my life. As a scientist, I raise the question of whether they are something which precede and determine my action or are always something by way of an observation of my own behavior after the fact or possibly before the fact if what I'm actually observing are the conditions which are to be responsible for my behavior in the future. I think we are arriving at two fairly satisfactory conditions here. We have identified, I think, some basic differences. On the other hand, I think that I have profited greatly from this. You asked whom I was talking to and felt that I was not talking to you in my opening remarks. You and I ought to be able to analyze verbal behavior better than that, it seems to me. You have been interested more than anyone else, I think, in the nature of verbal contact. I've written a book about it and have been interested in it too. I don't believe any more than you do in the communication of ideas back and forth, the implanting of opinions, attitudes, and so on. These, I think, are not effective ways of talking about verbal behavior. And I didn't come out here to tell you anything in the ordinary sense of communicating or to be told anything in that sense. I came out here to participate in a certain amount of verbal behavior as I might have come out here to play football or something like that, but I would hope to go away changed from this, and I think I am changed, although I may not know to what extent. There's a story about Gertrude Stein which is relevant here, I think. Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, her companion, were having dinner one night with Robert Hutchins when he was president of Chicago. Mortimer Adler was there and other intellects, and there was a very lively discussion. When the evening came to a close, Alice B. Toklas went up to Mortimer Adler and said, Gertrude Stein has said things here tonight it will take her months to understand. I look forward to a very good month following this process. Let's take a break.
During this next hour, we hope to function two ways to help you resolve perhaps some of the questions that you have been faced with. First half hour, we will deal with some written questions. Most of them were given to us last evening as a result of the group meetings. As a matter of fact, we have synthesized these into about 20, we have this many, which were in the hundreds, so this posed some problem for us. Out of the 20, we've tried to select 10. Let's hope we get beyond 5. I shall indicate the question. Each of the main participants have a copy of the list, and then ask the one to whom it was directed to respond. If the other person would like to respond, he may certainly do so. The first one is this, directed to Dr. Rogers. Is a subjective feeling of freedom sufficient evidence that this freedom is real and that man is not subject to the control of his genetic and environmental conditions?
I think that indicates some misunderstanding of the point of view I've presented, because, as I've said, I feel in thorough agreement with Dr. Skinner that viewed from the external, scientific, objective perspective, man is determined by his genetic and cultural influences. I've also said that in an entirely different dimension, such things as freedom and choice are extremely real. I think I would remind you of the example I gave of Viktor Frankl in the concentration camp. It would have been very interesting to try to tell him that the freedom of choice, which he felt remained to himself, was completely unreal. He knew it was real because he saw people who did not exercise that, who felt they really were completely controlled, die like flies, where the ones who had the best chance of survival were those who still retained the concept that I am a person, I choose. And so, for me, this is an entirely different dimension, which is not easily reconcilable to the deterministic point of view. I look at it as being similar to the situation in physics, where you can prove that the wave theory of light is supported by evidence. So is the corpuscular theory. The two of them are contradictory. They're not at the present state of knowledge reconcilable, but I think one would only be narrowing his perception of physics to deny one of those and accept only the other. And it is in this same sense, that's why I keep using the term paradox, that I regard these two dimensions as both real, although they exist in a paradoxical relationship.
Dr. Skinner, do you have a response?
Yes, there are areas in the world where people have very little of this conception of self or of personal worth, and it is very difficult for us, coming from our culture, to deal with them or to understand what is involved or why they are not more active in their own behalf. I would trace this difference not to a genetic difference, or nothing to do with the basic structure of the organisms in these two parts of the world, but rather to what we call the literature of democracy. When you are trying to overthrow the despotic control of a ruler, your only strength is likely to be found in the people themselves. The literature of democracy has provided a long history in which the individual has been assured that he is the ultimate source of power, which is true, that he himself can rise against someone who would control him, that by organizing with others who have similar inclinations, he can become a powerful force, and that in some sense he can rule himself, or at least he can consent to being ruled by someone who rules more in line with his own interests. Now that was, as I see it, a discovery. It was a discovery of a theory of democracy, and I don't mean Greek or Roman democracy, which was that of an elite. This was a discovery of the importance of the common man and of the fact that you could bring this to his attention and convert him into a person who was able to take political and usually revolutionary military activity and overthrow other kinds of control. Now, we have this in our culture. We do teach our children that they themselves are the final measure, that life is designed for them, and that if they are not getting what they want, they can do something about it. And this carried over rather feebly, it would seem, to concentration camps and to prisoner of war camps, for example, in Korea under the Chinese. There seems to be some evidence that the democratic way of life is suffering. It's not being transmitted by our culture well. And I think I can see the reasons for this. It is in conflict
with certain scientific facts about personal freedom and initiative. And I'm interested in trying to work out a philosophy which will do just as much for the individual, but which will not take on the expression concerned with inner initiating activity, which have served their purpose and I think are now outmoded.
The second question, directed mainly to Dr. Skinner. You spoke of your preference for studying observable behaviors rather than less observable areas such as personality traits. Do you regard the study and measurement of these behaviors as sufficient for the science of human behavior, or do you feel you must then move up the abstraction ladder and somehow relate observable behaviors to broader concepts such as personality?
Well, I'm aware of the oversimplification of the operant situation as an experimental situation. All early science is oversimplified because you can't do anything until you develop techniques which will permit you to handle simple relations. Once you have those, you can handle more complex. In current work in the field of operant conditioning, we deal with very elaborate samples or segments of behavior, and we could, I think, set up a reasonable analogy to some of the problems we've been discussing at this conference. However, I'll hold my remarks on the difference between pigeons and people until later. The question about personality is not whether it is an area to be studied, but whether it is a useful concept. It is one of these inner terms. I think it has been a dangerous one. If you say that a juvenile delinquent is suffering from a disordered personality, and then you want to explain the disordered personality, you will have to get back to the individual's earlier history, and perhaps possibly genetic factors, but very much more likely is cultural conditioning. And once you've got back there, I think you can use those facts to explain the juvenile delinquency itself, rather than going through the middle term of personality. As I see it, personality is an explanatory fiction which does at times seem to offer the chance of talking about broader patterns of behavior, greater constellations of behavior than are conveniently handled in terms of behavior itself. And it may serve some heuristic purpose at this stage in our knowledge, although I would always caution the person interested in personality that he must eventually get back to what it is that, as you say, expresses a personality, and that once this is analyzed effectively, you will come up with an alternative way of dealing with these problems which would be much more satisfactory when you come to do anything about this. I would want to relate problem behavior to the various conditions which influence behavior without calling it the expression of a problem-ridden personality. I see no advantage in the other term except a temporary one in permitting you to talk about what seem like pretty big issues and not too awkward a way. I think the saving in awkwardness is paid for at a very great price.
Dr. Rogers, you want to respond to that?
I might comment just very briefly. Every time a question has to do with scientific procedure, Dr. Skinner and I find ourselves in a great deal of agreement. I think, too, that from the perspective of science, it is observable behavior that we are both interested in. For example, in trying to study the process of change as it occurs in psychotherapy, we've been spending a great deal of time in trying to analyze out the observable behaviors which are indicative of change and to study those observable behaviors. I think that insofar as theory is concerned, that as our science matures, more and more theories will be the reconciliation and integration of large bodies of observed data rather than taking off into outer space and being primarily constructions of fantasy.
The next question is directed to both and of a little different vein. Is this just another philosophical discussion about free will versus determinism? If not, how does it differ?
I think it is not just another philosophical discussion, because we are both concerned with very important practical consequences. I am concerned with arriving at a conception of the individual which is one we accept, find useful, find dignified and worthwhile yet which is in line with and compatible with the approach of a natural science or a social science to human behavior. I feel the time has come when this issue must be taken out of the realm of philosophical discussion and deliberately faced. If we are still, as we are in political science, in literary criticism, in many areas dealing with human behavior, is still likely to be dealing with a conception of man which allows a great deal of free play for caprice, individual, spontaneous changes, of course, and so on, we are going to get into trouble. We must make palatable and, I hope, worthwhile a different kind of picture of man. And while the issue of determinism is certainly raised here, I should hope that what we've said here will go well beyond what is usually said in late evening discussions of that topic in dormitories.
I would certainly agree that this doesn't seem to me either to be a philosophical discussion about free will versus determinism. I think, for one thing, both of us agree that when viewed from a scientific perspective, man's behavior does appear to be determined, and that the whole realm of the behavioral sciences is interested in studying those sequences of cause and effect. I think I have tried to indicate that our science should be broad enough to include a concern with and an interest in the subjective as well as the purely external behaviors. Then I have also indicated, as I did a moment ago in response to the other question, that I believe that we need recognition of the fact that a scientific perspective is not all of life, and in my estimation is not a sufficient basis for a total philosophy of life or of persons. So that to me is what the discussion has been about.
The next question is more of a practically oriented type, and I assume primarily for Dr. Rogers, although Dr. Skinner might want to respond also. Can a high school counselor use both conditioning principles and Rogerian psychotherapy with equal effectiveness?
I think that a high school counselor or any counselor is obligated to be continually searching for what is effective in producing constructive personality change. Fortunately, this question is one that in the long run will yield itself to empirical investigation. So far there have been few investigations along that line, and none that I know of with high school students, but one that is remotely related was a study by two men who endeavored to use 3 different types of therapy with alcoholics in an institution, and one of those was a learning theory type of approach, not an operant conditioning approach, but a learning theory type of approach. Another was an analytic approach. The third was a client-centered type of approach. And there the results were studied objectively in terms of tests, in terms of return to the hospital for alcoholism, and so on. And it has always been a research that has been of a good deal of interest to me, because the group carrying it on started out with the personal bias, and it's almost impossible in such a situation to escape some personal bias, but it would be the learning theory approach that would be most helpful. And as it turned out, that was the least helpful, in fact, showed objective evidence of having done some damage to these individuals. The one that turned out to be most effective was the client-centered approach. But I don't adopt that as final conclusion or anything of that sort. That was one study. We need to have many studies of what actually is effective in producing constructive change.
I'm not at all surprised that a learning theory approach could go wrong, because I've seen so many of them so badly designed that I wouldn't recognize them. I would want to know the details before I would confess to any anxiety about this particular case.
To make you less anxious, this was Maurer's learning theory, and he did serve as consultant on it, so it was put in terms that were realistic as he was concerned.
Yes, but that still doesn't reassure me. The word counseling here bothers me. I obviously not the authority at this table in that field, and I'm not at all happy about trying to conjure up some use of operant conditioning principles with respect to a student on one side of the table and the counselor on the other. I would
suggest that a lot needs to be done before a counselor could safely work simply in the field of reinforcement in helping people under those circumstances. I would say that a counselor who was interested in the mental health, shall we call it, of a school system might better spend his time not at that table at all, but looking into how the children are handled in the school, how they come to school, how their schedules are arranged, what things they get out of school, what problems arise because of the teachers with which they are matched up, and so on. I would take a more preventive therapy approach, I suppose, in this case. I'm sure that Dr. Rogers is interested in that, as I am too. But I don't feel that these problems must wait for a confrontation across a counseling table, or at least and certainly not on the counseling couch. I feel that the application to education of the principles that I find productive and useful would be much more concerned with the total design of the educational system than dealing with its special effects on individual students.
The following question is directed to both. What is the role of a, quote, code of conduct, unquote, or, quote, religion, unquote, in a culture as you view it?
I have tried to give a good deal of thought to the question of the way in which people arrive at their values. To me, thinking along that line is relevant to this question. I'm afraid code of conduct is a phrase that would not have much meaning to me in the kind of culture I was trying to describe very briefly this morning. On the other hand, the kind of a valuing process which seems to be characteristic of psychologically mature people in our culture, I would hope would be characteristic of individuals in the sort of culture I would like to see established. And I'm not sure that I can communicate that briefly, but I will try. It seems to me that the person who is psychologically mature tends to be open to the various aspects of his experience. He is open to the external aspects, the demands of society, the likelihood of smooth or turbulent interpersonal relationships, the legal demands, the demands of the physical environment, and so on. He's also open to and sensitive to the feeling reactions and personal meanings which exist in his own experiencing, which grow out of his own past learnings. And out of that, it seems to me, every new object, every new event is evaluated by him in his own experiencing as either making for his own welfare or not making for his own welfare. That is, that the most sensitive, valuing process in existence exists, I believe, in the psychologically mature person. And that when he is engaged in this valuing process, in the interaction with his environment and so on, that this is not a selfish kind of valuing, even though he, to be sure, values things as to whether they make for his own actualization or not. But it is an essentially social kind of valuing process, simply because of the nature of the human animal, who turns out to be a highly social animal at heart. So that I would not be inclined to discuss a code of conduct. I would not be inclined to discuss a religion in this society, in this culture I was trying to describe. But I would be much concerned that individuals were able sensitively and openly to be their own evaluators of the experiences and events in which they were involved.
I see the question as bearing on the whole issue of the evolution of cultural practices. When a group of people start living together, they begin to affect each other. They are part of the environments of each other. A strong man may, for example, despoil all the others because of his own personal strength, but the others quickly in terms of evolutionary time, may very well counter-control by organizing and by calling it wrong to use force. Later, someone becomes clever and uses his wits and deceives other people, deceives perhaps even the strong man. This is Brer Rabbit deceiving Brer Wolf and Brer Fox. Brer Fox also comes into it on the side of the Sharpie. But then it is decided that it is wrong to misrepresent, it's wrong to deceive. I don't mean it's decided in the sense anybody sits down and comes to that conclusion. You just start punishing in very group ways people who use force, deceive others, and so on. Now that can all go on without codification, and I'm sure that the Jews practiced the principles in the Ten Commandments before they were codified. The value of the codification is that it clarifies the practices of the group, makes it possible for the individual to conform more readily. It's an instructional kind of thing. And you see that if you turn away from cultural technology to physical technology. Early physical techniques, such as had to be taught by an artisan to an apprentice, often were put in the form of rules, of what we would take to be, in the case of cultures, maxims or proverbs. For example, in the Middle Ages, the blacksmith, bringing a boy in to operate the bellows which kept his forge going, taught the boy this little poem which goes as follows: up high, down low, up fast, down slow, and that's the way to blow. Now, actually what is involved here is the proper operation of a bellows. You must take the full excursion, up high, down low. On the way up, nothing is happening, so it's up fast, down slow. Otherwise, you'll blow the fire apart, actually. So that after you once learned just a little poem, you've become an expert bellows boy. You can just up high, down low, up fast, down slow. Now, Ernst Mach pointed out in his History of Science and Mechanics that early scientific laws are probably of this sort. They are statements of effective behavior, or they guide effective behavior. And there is no mystery to the fact that the great codifiers, the great lawgivers, have always been highly honored. The Romans played a great role in civilization in codifying laws which undoubtedly were practiced before they were ever codified. And I think there is something to be gained from codification. You can teach precept instead of practice. And I think we gave up a great deal when we decided that we have to teach ethical and moral principles only by practice and not by precept. I see no reason why, as you teach science by precept, you can't teach ethics by precept too. And you can do it if you can control the motivation of the student. And generally, this turning to practice instead of precept has been a search for motivation for the student rather than for effective instruction. Now, the difference between a moral code of that sort and a religion is, to me, simply a difference in the implied or expressed sanctions involved. If you simply say that if you behave in this way, people will like you, you'll get along, everyone will be better off, that is a naturalistic religion. It is pointing to the consequences which make a cultural practice worthwhile. If you say, on the other hand, that the code has been revealed by a prophet, that it is the word of God, and the sanctions lie in another world, and that if you follow the code, you will be rewarded by that epitome of all rewards, heaven, and if you don't, you will be punished by that epitome of all negative reinforcement, hell, then you are working in the field of religion. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that these have been effective sanctions and may continue to be so. The naturalistic approach is to argue that man does not need that kind of supernatural sanction and that it is possible to have a purely humanistic ethics. I think this is something which remains to be demonstrated. But all of this question of the codification seems to me to be a cultural invention, a cultural design, which clarifies the controlling forces which the group exercises over the behavior of the individual.
I'd like to make one small facetious comment that perhaps the trouble with meetings of this sort and with any attempt to settle issues between individuals or groups is that we don't follow that bellows motto. Instead, we should up slowly in order to gradually take in and really understand what is being said, but usually we up fast. We should down slow in order to only thoughtfully express ourselves. What usually happens is we down fast and out comes a great gush of air.
May
I point out, however, that what goes into the fire is cold air.
Good point.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward the cassette to the end, and then turn to side 2 for the continuation of this program.
Our next question is again directed to both in an applied area. How do Rogers and Skinner perceive the problem of parental control and influences on child rearing practices? How would they handle a child from birth to age 6? Don't fall over yourselves, please.
In 2 minutes, I assume.
I don't want to sit up here and imply that I'm available to answer all questions you may ask. There are too many that I haven't the vaguest idea how the average American home can arrange those conditions which I am fairly sure I could specify to raise a happy, well-informed, skillful, creative, productive child. I think I failed in my own case as a parent, and I rather subscribe to Fraser's statement that home is not the place to rear children.
I guess my comments would apply to whoever rears them, whether in or out of the home. Like Dr. Skinner, I would agree that this is what I think should be done, not what I have been able to do. But it seems to me that the kind of psychological climate which promotes growth and development is the same whether we're talking about therapy or the school or home. And I believe that we are making genuinely solid scientific progress in learning the elements and attitudes which compose a psychological climate, which does make for the most constructive, most solid individual and personal development. The kinds of attitudes that I think are shown to be useful in therapy, and I suspect would show up as being useful and promising at home, are those that I've mentioned in some of the papers you have and so on. I think the evidence indicates that people who are real, who are not afraid of exhibiting themselves in terms of the feelings they're actually experiencing, those are more constructive individuals in human relationships than those who are putting up a facade. I think that a climate in which the individual is prized, whether we're talking about a small child or a therapy client, helps to create a useful climate for growing persons. I think that when an individual finds that his inner life of meanings is really understood by another person so that he doesn't live in an existential isolation, this too seems to be of assistance in making him a human being, in helping him to grow and develop. And I suspect that those attitudes would be useful in child rearing. Then I have an odd notion about the kind of limitations that would be most helpful in the rearing of a child. So often we think of that in terms of what can the child be permitted to do, what can't he be permitted to do, and so on. I would like to see as much as possible of that very necessary limitation of behavior grow out of confrontation of feelings. I've often said that the mother who was all worn out and says to her child at night, "Well, I don't think you've been getting enough sleep lately. I think it'd be best if you went to bed an hour early tonight," is in for trouble. She's not being genuine. She gets resistance, etc. If she could be honest about what she is feeling, that I am simply too tired tonight to put up with you for another minute. You're going to bed. I can't stand you any longer. This would be a far more healthy kind of relationship. The child still will be unhappy about going to bed, but he's unhappy because of the real reason, and this can exist as a real aspect of the relationship between them. Also, it has a reciprocal effect on the mother, that having really expressed her feeling of, "I've had it," she then realizes she has other feelings too, and she's going to put that child to bed more tenderly than she would had she gone under the facade. So my notion of the best in limitations on child behavior is when the child's feelings are in real contact with the parent's feelings, and out of that comes some realistic limitation of behavior that is, over the long run, mutually acceptable. In given instances, it may be more acceptable to one than to the other, but over the long run, you arrive at a realistic relationship of feelings that is mutually acceptable and which helps the person to live in a human world of feelings, because he has had to react to and adjust to the real feelings of another person, and to do that in terms of his own real feelings.
I think at this point we have come to the second part of our question period. Some of the questions which we could not answer that were submitted to us in writing, perhaps some of you would be willing to raise in person. I suggest that perhaps we start on my immediate left and swing around the room. Any questions on the immediate left? Yes, ma'am. The question is, as I understand it, in an ideal community where we reduce all tensions, would we also reduce the existence of a genius or of like individual?
I take it that's directed at me. Freud faced the same question after having shown that great works of genius were essentially neurotic, then proposed to cure neuroses, which would indicate that he has something against genius, or at least works of genius. But he had an answer, and I think it is a perfectly good one, that people are geniuses against whatever background they may be living in. And in a world where there are many neuroses, some of these will be really fine neuroses, and we will call them works of art or works of genius. But in a world in which people are living a more orderly life, a more successful life, there will be works of genius also, because of the capacity of man to do great things, but they will be rather different. It won't be an art based upon neurotic tendencies. There won't be a literature deals with personal conflicts if there are no personal conflicts. An example of this, imagine the case in which, in children's stories, a fireman is portrayed as an heroic person. This is an appropriate example to use today in Duluth. It's very important, if you have buildings that are likely to burn down, to have brave firemen. But now you invent fireproof buildings and get rid of all the ones that are not fireproof. There's no longer any need for a brave fireman. This means that in the world of the future, all of those things you love to read about as a child will not exist, and something will be missing. Same thing is true, in a much more important way, with respect to war. Now, poets are awfully good at glorifying anything that happens to need glorifying. In the past, war has been inevitable. I hope it is not in the future, but we have covered this up and learned to enjoy it by making heroes out of warriors. And a great part of the literature of the world is dealt with heroic warriors. But now, if we do achieve a world which is at peace, and this is so complete that we can't imagine a world at war, we will not be interested in the literature having to do with heroes who kill other people in battle. And I should suppose that the works of, say, Dostoevsky would be relatively meaningless in a world in which no one had any fantastic need to confess an imagined sin or something of this kind. Personally, I would settle for that. I would sacrifice the works of Dostoevsky to reach such a world, and I don't for a moment imagine that people are going to be any less creative, any less imaginative, or any less geniuses because their subject matters are going to be of a different nature. There are a few cases in point of people who have been very productive artistically, and it doesn't seem to have been mainly a question of working off neuroses. Johann Sebastian Bach had 19 children, and we can conclude something from that about his patterns. And yet he could not help writing music. On his deathbed, he was still composing music. That's a Freudian answer, and I would use it myself. I'm sure that there are activities in which the genius which is in man will manifest itself, and that if it is not dealing with neurotic topics, so much the better.
And I would agree with that last sentence, but in general I would take a slightly different approach to this question. In the kind of culture I tried to talk about briefly this morning, I hope I didn't give the impression that there would be no tension. I think that the kind of tension that would exist, I just gave a very minute example of in talking about the mother and child. There are always tensions in interpersonal relations. There are also tensions in all of us as we face new and more demanding tasks in life. And I think that out of those constructive tensions, which are less than the completely destructive tensions which can also occur, out of those constructive tensions in life, there will be loads of creativity and plenty of genius, in my estimation.
Question in this part of the audience? Yes. As I get the question, is perhaps we have not given due notice to the power of positive reinforcement, and is Roger's concept of self-actualization tied in with this? Dr. Skinner?
Directed to me. Well, I don't think for a moment that positive reinforcement is the only process which can be used in the design of a culture. It happens to be, I think, a very important one. But a total analysis of the various mainsprings of human action seems to me to be relevant to any phase of human behavior. And I won't say that I would improve Dr. Rogers' practices by reinterpreting what he does in my own terms, but I think I could do that. I'm sure we are both dealing with the human organism as given by the genetic human process, and that to the extent that we are successful, we have discovered important characteristics of that organism. I would like to see the human being actualize himself, reach his fullest potentiality, and I'm sure that when we once get any glimpse of that, it's going to be a very surprising thing.
I don't know that I get this question with sufficient clarity to comment on it too helpfully, but I think I would say that reinforcement is surely a positive tool. I think that in developing the potential of the individual, we have often thought only of external reinforcements. I think that the nature of the human organism is such that many things are discovered to be internally rewarding. For example, I think we do not have to reward the child for curious and exploratory behavior. That is something which organismically he finds satisfying. I think that would be true of a number of the life activities of the individual who is moving toward the development of his potentialities.
Question in this area? Yes, way back there. As I understand the question, that perhaps the two sets of values of Rogers and Skinner are about the same, and in particular for Dr. Skinner, does the way that he trains his own students differ from how one might deal in psychotherapy?
Well, I don't know that I'm any happier about the way I train my students than I am with the way that I raise my own children, that I don't have too much control over the educational environment either, although I'm trying to do more about that, perhaps. I do agree with Wendell Johnson last night in supposing that there is something called rational behavior, which is usually exemplified in science, and that you want to get a patient in therapy, I suppose, to see the world about him and his own problems in rational rather than irrational terms. I think perhaps Dr. Rogers would hold that there are emotional or experiential elements here that would be rather different from the scientific process. But insofar as it is helpful to respond to the world in a rational way, then I would suppose that good education is a kind of at least preventive therapy, if it could not be used also for therapy after trouble had arisen. I've spent quite a lot of time in analyzing superstitious behavior and other forms of irrational behavior. I think you can show that the techniques of science are designed to protect us against some of this, and to that extent they are useful cultural practices. And I'm sure that a therapist is doing something of the same sort in clarifying influences which have had a deleterious effect and bringing the individual more strictly under the control of the environment as it actually is.
I welcome being reminded of that article of Dr. Skinner's in the American Psychologist, which was a very inspiring article on the processes of science as he had experienced them in his own career. This is the one you're talking about, isn't it? I hadn't quite thought of that in relationship to this discussion. As I remember that article, Dr. Skinner there gives a very vivid picture of the scientific life as process. And this is exactly the kind of thing which I've been trying to describe as the good life from any angle, that far from knowing where he was going to come out, he had to live in process and had to let learnings emerge as they emerged, and they shaped his new behavior and so on. Somehow this makes me feel a great deal better about Dr. Skinner, to realize that in his own life, he values that emerging, unpredictable process. And I guess what I've been trying to say about the kind of culture I would want to design and the kind of outcomes I see in therapy when therapy is successful, it leads to exactly that kind of thing, that the individual becomes an ongoing process of life in which the outcome is not set. There are not static goals. You don't even know whether you will come out happy. You are living this on a day-by-day basis, endeavoring to be open to all of your experience. This was another real aspect in that article, of endeavoring to be open to all aspects of what had occurred in order to learn from them. This, I think, is a very good example, very closely related to Wendell Johnson's notion of the personal life as being essentially the living of a scientific approach. On this, we could really get together, because to me this sense of life as a process which can only be existentially lived if it is to be meaningful, that makes all kinds of sense. Makes to me much more sense than saying, here is where we should come out, and we must plan it that way.
This may be a historic moment. I think I have been changed by that argument. The point of that article was actually to criticize the codification of science by methodologists, statisticians, design and experiment people who, having very little experience with science as it is practiced, try to tell you how the scientist works. I think it's a great mistake that we teach our young psychologists science in the form of statistics, because this has very little to do with actual scientific practice. However, I'm not going to concede everything, because I am interested in teaching scientific practice as such. And I should suppose that with skillful planning, one could make sure that more people would be the product of lucky histories of this sort than is now the case. I'm sure I've had a great deal of luck, which has not only directed me in profitable directions, but has kept me going by the very lucky schedule of reinforcement which I have experienced. But I think this ought to be viewed as a very important factor in building scientific dedication, and some of it can be arranged, although I quite agree that you cannot foresee all of the courses it's going to take. I'm now beginning to understand what you mean by becoming.
This is very meaningful to me, because I quite share your feeling that I too would want to teach a scientific approach and so on. I do want to stress again the fact that the kind of professional living and the experiencing of a professional scientific life, which you were describing in that article, comes, as you say, very, very close to what I'm talking about when I talk about a person in process of becoming. This would be most gratifying to find that we do strike some deep similarity on that score.
I think we have time for one last question in this section. Yes, sir. As I get the question is, on these internal factors or variables, Dr. Skinner has indicated that one can always identify external causes. And what would lead one not to conclude that one could start with these as the possible originating causes?
I think the question is mainly concerned with the practice of science. I quite agree that the whole causal stream goes on back indefinitely, that there must be some reason why the environment is as it is at the moment it influences an individual and so on. I question these things mainly because of their historical connotations of mentalism, of non-physical mediators or manipulators of physical events, which I don't think is a useful approach at all. Now, if you take these inner events to be eventually, when the physiologists get around to it, discoverable as such, then I don't deny that if something happens to me as a child, and today my inability to deal openly with a colleague reflects the anxiety that results from my having been punished for striking my brother or something like that. Something has lasted in me, if that is a correct connection. Something has survived in me from punishment for sibling rivalry 50 years ago to my inability to deal openly with a figurative brother in the group today. Something has survived, it is there. The question is the dimensions of this, and my objection to these inner experiential, if not mentalistic, events is that they don't very adequately report what change must have been made in me 50 years ago, nor do they offer very much help in predicting what is now happening to me as a result of that event 50 years ago. And supposing you say that while I was punished for repeatedly striking my brother until I reached the point where I didn't strike him, but I always felt anxious because I was on the point of striking him, that I have an anxiety, and that has persisted to the present time, and it makes it impossible for me to be open with my friends today, or something like that. What does the word anxiety do here? Now you can say, well, you can feel anxious. Well, that's true. And if I have been punished for striking someone and am now inclined to strike, and this generates physiological changes in me which I then report as anxiety, all right. But the word anxiety is not carrying the history of that punishment very accurately, and it certainly is not giving many details to the prediction of what I cannot or can do at the present time. I'm not questioning that something has happened in the individual which is inside him, and I don't question the fact that someday, and I think a little bit distant future, the neurologists and physiologists will tell us what that is. I am criticizing the purely verbal use of these concepts at the present time, because I think they damage our case by making us believe we know more than we do know, and by mischaracterizing what are often important variables.
On this score, I would find myself in real general agreement with Dr. Skinner. I feel that there has been much too much use made of internal events as though we knew them descriptively, and then we use them as explanations of causes of other events. And this long-range inference, where you reach a mile for an inference, has never appealed to me, and I don't really believe it is a justifiable part of science. I think that one of the young men who was working with us as a postdoctoral fellow a year or two ago, Alan Bergen, has written a couple of papers. I like both the content, but I particularly like the title. They're under the general title of Toward a Science of Subjective Experience. And what he is doing is pointing out the progress we are making in determining objective cues of inner subjective events, which will bring us closer to being able to study objectively some of the internal meanings and subjective experiences, which I think we, all of us, tend to agree are no doubt, in fact, operating in our behavior. The question is, how close can we get to them in studying them? I would also point out that this interest in trying to get more objective cues to the subjective aspects of experience is related to, but by no means the same as, the stress on the importance of the subjective in life, which I've stressed earlier.
Then to Dr. Skinner as presenting his closing statement first.
I want to take up this question of planning and whether it in any way injures the product planned. It is very important, I think, to keep in mind the fact that a culture, any culture at any time, is a kind of behavioral experiment. Every child born into American life today will come under certain very powerful cultural practices. Have an education which makes the most of the capacities of the genetic stock of American life. If we have ethical, religious, and moral practices which keep people behaving with respect to each other in ways which reduce their need to defend themselves against attack and worries and that kind and so on, then America is strong, and we will continue to develop better practices
and we will make a very important contribution to the practices of the future, which, of course, none of us can foresee at the present time. Now, these things work in a way something like biological evolution, but not entirely. In cultural evolution, you have a Lamarckian practice. Someone hits upon a cultural practice, a new way of handling children in kindergarten, a new way of paying wages. There are thousands of these little cultural designs, inventions. Some of them survive because they contribute to the strength of the group. Others disappear because they produce trouble. And in this way, we advance through codification or otherwise, we build a corpus of cultural practices which is to be tested, whether we like it or not, in the crucible of survival. If Russia or China or some other broad culture is going to advance more rapidly, then whether we like it or not, we shall have to take second place. I don't think that for a moment. With Russia a year ago, not at all impressed by the way in which they energize the human behavior of their people, not impressed by their standards of a good life or anything of that sort. But I still don't think we can rest on our laurels, and I think it behooves us to examine culture. Now, this is, when it occurs, a new stage, because if you simply hit upon a cultural invention as an accident, or because of the personal idiosyncrasies of someone, it may turn out to be a very good practice. Whether it's good or not has very little to do with its origins or where it came from. A person who is perhaps quite unintelligent might hit upon a better way of rearing his children, and it would be copied by others and become an established practice for a long time. The origins are not important. The survival effects are. But at some point in the history of this evolutionary process, something new emerges. And this is the growth of science as a way of dealing with nature and the eventual application of science to human behavior. And when that has come about, when the techniques of science have been well developed and brought to bear on the problem of human behavior, then we are in a better position to see the relation between cultural practices and the resulting strong or weak behavior of the individual who has been submitted to them. And then we can design, we can plan practices because of predicted effects, which will be important to us. And they will be important to us just in the same way in which the accidental practices are important to us, and they will survive or disappear in the same way also. So that at some point, with the development of the science of behavior, man is able to accelerate the evolution of cultures by designing practices instead of allowing them just to arise through accident in one way or another. This is also true in genetic evolution. We are now able, to some extent, to change the germplasm. We've been able a long time by selection of parents, to change genetic structures. We can produce mutations, and the chemists are not far off, I'm sure, from making rather specific changes in chromosomes and so on. At that point, something new will have occurred in the evolution of the organism as a biological entity, and already something new has occurred in the evolution of cultures as evolving and surviving entities. So that we can, by using intelligence and the scientific method, improve our culture. Now, this can be interpreted, however, as meddling, as doing something about other people, as trying to control other people. And, of course, the word control is as someone pointed out last night, a value-charged word. We have all been controlled for purposes of exploitation. We've been controlled through techniques which are aversive in themselves and so on. So we have had and developed a philosophy which is opposed to control and even opposed to planning. Now, I think this is silly. I think if we try to insist that human culture not be planned, we shall close the door on a remarkable opportunity which may never come to us again. To refer to another critic of Walden, too, Joseph Wood Crouch, who has attacked the book violently just because it is planned, let me suggest the following situation to you. Mr. Crouch prefers the Southwest and wanders around out there as a sort of an amateur naturalist. Suppose in his wanderings He came to a mesa and climbed up and discovered a tribe of Indians living there under conditions which are exactly comparable to Walden 2. Their educational system prepares them for the life they're going to meet. The children are well cared for, happy, productive. They have economic practices which give them all a simple but an abundant good life. They have what they need to eat, clothe themselves. They have artistic activities and so on. Music flourishes and all of this. Wooden Crooks come down out of that mountain, shouting to the world, what fools we are, this is it. Here is a way of life that is acceptable to me because it is maximizing all of the potentialities of people who are living in it. But then some Indian following him down out of the mesa taps him on the shoulder and says, there's just one thing I forgot to tell you. An old Indian named Skinner planned it this way. That would destroy the whole thing. That someone had thought this out, rather than that it had been the product of an accidental evolution of cultures, would make it absolutely worthless. Because that old Indian would have had all sorts of despotic, tyrannical motives. And even though he's dead now, perhaps, or no one knows who he is, he will have been controlling people. These people will be living the life which he planned. Now, if we ourselves silly as to allow our reactions to past patterns of control to interfere with our free exercise of science and the design of culture, then we're going to get exactly what we're going to get. Somebody else will not be that silly, and they will be the people who will contribute to the world of the future.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward the cassette to the end, and then turn to side 2 for the continuation of this program.
I've forgotten who it was that remarked last night that we would be really discovering the learnings in this meeting for weeks and months afterward. I certainly feel that's very true. I find it very difficult to come up with any really concluding remarks. I think I would like to say I've acquired an increasing respect for Dr. Skinner the person. His sincerity, gentleness, his wit, his wide scholarly interest, the honesty with which he is trying to face the implications of the directions in which the behavioral sciences are taking us. I certainly have learned deeply from him, both in the past and during these meetings. I have often felt and would like to say that I think he is the one person in the behavioral stream of psychology who has really had a highly significant impact on our society and our culture, and I respect his work. I think that there do remain some profound differences between us, though I think definitely less than when these discussions commenced. But I suspect that the deeper differences will not be reconciled by us, they will be reconciled by you and by other people. One thing that I thought might come up for mention in this discussion, but it hasn't so far, is that, I don't know whether Dr. Skinner is aware of it, but a former student of his and a former student of mine are working together on developing a programmed instruction for the improvement of interpersonal relationships. Are you aware of that? So that in sort of the second generation, it seems possible that there will be significant tensions as there are between the two who are working on that, but nevertheless working toward a reconciliation. I see very large areas of agreement between us, which I won't particularly try to specify. One is the fact that many of these remarks Dr. Skinner has just made do point toward the fact that a behavioral science is going to have or may at least have a very significant part in designing our culture. And the profound question remains of what kind of a part it will play. We certainly have real agreement on the rules of science and in regard to the human being when he's looked at through a scientific perspective. I think that from this perspective, we both see behavior as determined. We both see the possibility of establishing preconditions which lead to desired effects and which do, in essence, lead to the basis for a design of culture. But there is a real difference in regard to the way science is viewed by us. As I see it, Skinner sees himself and the world and the individual in his Walden 2 as nothing but automated figures moving inexorably in their preordained path. I hold this perspective as a fruitful one in my work as a scientist, but not as a total worldview and as inadequate as a viewpoint toward all of man. I think it's obvious all through our discussions that one of our sharpest differences is in regard to the place of the subjective. To me, words like freedom have deep experiential meaning and reality and significance. And I hope that I've helped to indicate that when we do believe in individual freedom and choice as a paradoxical reality in a determined world, then we take different steps in different directions and have a different kind of regard for the human individual than we do if we do not hold that view. I believe that this is one point on which we really differ, although I have been surprised at several of the things I have heard Dr. Skinner say and feel now that I'm a little unsure as to just where he does stand. With real conviction, one point yesterday, he said, "I believe." I was so shaken by this, I've forgotten just what it was he believed. When he mentioned that if we were to design a culture, it would be necessary to choose the values which we wish to establish. And when this morning, a few moments ago, he spoke of working out a philosophy which would be appropriate. To me, a philosophy is the meaning of experience. That seems to me to be quite contradictory to some of the things you said. So I'm not sure. At any rate, it has come through clearly that he has and lives a subjective life in which belief and freedom operate. But it also seems to me that he attaches secondary or little importance to the subjective life for others and doesn't consider it very seriously in his design of a culture. In this respect, I think I do differ rather deeply. Another difference that has interested me through this discussion is that I believe Dr. Skinner doesn't discriminate at all between control and influence. To me, those seem quite discriminable. To me, it's important whether the person with whom we're dealing has a participative choice. And if I understand him correctly, this seems to him to be quite secondary and not particularly important. Take, for example, our own impact on this audience. I would not see it as comparable to shaping up the behavior of pigeons to play ping pong. And yet, if I get his viewpoint correctly, to him these two would be basically identical. Now, the thing which for me differentiates it from dealing with pigeon behavior is that one of the things I prize about this meeting is that you're free to choose subjectively what you wish to accept and reject of what we are saying. One of the things that I would value not only for this meeting, but for any kind of culture I would hope to have any part in designing, is that it would be full of experiences like this, where people would be faced with the difficulty and reality of choice, where you are exposed to differing facts, viewpoints, opinions, and so on, and must within yourself choose the stance that you are going to take in regard to such issues. To me, I would want that to be, and regard it as being, one of the essential bases for maximizing the human potential, is to make continually available the opportunity and the necessity of choice. Another point in which perhaps we differ, and here again I'm a bit puzzled, is in regard to the value of genuineness. I have come to feel, particularly in my work in therapy, that one of the most important values in human relationships is the quality of genuineness, of one person being in real and genuine contact with another, an individual being as completely as he is able to be the feelings which he's experiencing at that moment. And in a culture that I would have any part in designing, I would hope that the leaders would be, words you may not like, would be transparent, that they would not be concealing, that they would be people who would be willing to expose their views, attitudes, feelings to the individuals with whom they were working, so that encounters with other individuals would be real and based on the existent inner realities. There's no question in my mind about the personal genuineness of Dr. Skinner, but I get puzzled when he talks about designing cultures, because there it seems as though, to oversimplify and perhaps be a little extreme, it seems as though nothing is for real. It is the behaviors which are induced are for other purposes, not for themselves. I think I understand that in that he feels that since all human relationships are simply manipulations, whether we know it or not, then the quality of genuineness doesn't have much significance. I think I can understand that, but it doesn't square with my experience. Then another difference that I would recognize is over our willingness to control. And here again, this difference between control and influence comes up. I myself would certainly hope to be able, feel that often at times I am able, both in dealing with individuals and with groups, to try to establish conditions which free and release and make for spontaneity, so that I do help to establish preconditions which bring about certain consequences. And my experiences in doing that have been such as to give me a great deal of confidence in the basic characteristics of the human individual when he is free. So that my whole aim would be to provide conditions for optimal release and growth rather than being primarily interested in control. There's one helpful, hopeful, and ironic thing that I'd like to mention. That is that for a man who believes that the words value and choice and purpose really retain very little of their ordinary meaning in a scientific world, there is just no question that what Dr. Skinner's work has stirred up, will continue to stir up enormous controversy over choice of values and purpose and the directions that we choose to go. And in this sense, I guess I feel he's really on my side, because that's exactly what I would like to do too. That's the way I see the purpose of this meeting, that we have tried to expose various points of view, various possible purposes, various values in regard to education, in regard to the design of a future culture, and that the choice of those values is going to be something we all will be working on over the years to come.